Bueno, muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to today's committee meeting.
Bienvenidos al comité de hoy.
Welcome to today's Fisheries Committee. As you know, the first item on our agenda is the adoption of the agenda. So unless there are any objections, I would propose that we adopt the agenda. Let's now move on then. As the agenda is hereby adopted, we'll move on to the Chair's announcements. I need to remind you that I have had to add, under item 7 of the agenda, a short vote at the end of today's meeting at 6:30. This is an issue that the fisheries coordinators were not able to agree upon with a broad majority, but a decision has to be taken because a deadline has been set by the Conference of Presidents. So you have received all the details of the report by email circulated by the Secretariat last Tuesday, together with the draft agenda and the voting list, so that we can hold the vote at the end of today's meeting. So that will be 6:30 p.m. So we need to vote, as you'll remember, on whether we will include this item in the work of our committee. This is a report which is left over from the previous Parliament, and we have to decide whether we are going to continue work upon it. Now, under item 3, adoption of the minutes, I'd like to invite you. Well, if you have any objections, of course, please say, but otherwise we would adopt the minutes of our meetings of the 23rd and 24th of July. So now's the time if you have any objections to those minutes. Otherwise, they will be deemed adopted. Any comments on the minutes? Well, in that case, they are hereby adopted. And we now move on to our fourth item, which is the proposal for regulation setting for 2025 the fishing opportunities for certain fish stocks applicable in the Baltic Sea. The first item is the tax and quotas for 2025 in the Baltic Sea. And it's not surprising that our Scandinavian colleagues have requested a discussion on this proposal. On the 26th of August, the Commission adopted this proposal, fixing the fishing opportunities for the commercially most important fish stocks in the Baltic Sea for 2025. And in order to simplify the annual procedure for the adoption of tax and quotas, the fishing opportunities in the Baltic Sea are adopted in a separate regulation, which the Council will be adopting already in mid-October. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Donatella from DG Mare to present the Commission's proposal on fishing opportunities in the Baltic Sea for 2025. Mr. Donatella, you have the floor, and then, of course, I'll give the floor to any member of the committee who would like to speak. Mr. Donatella.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And first of all, let me thank you also for the possibility for the Commission to present today the 2025 proposal for decision on the fishing opportunity for the Baltic. I have to say, it's also a pleasure for me because I am sure that I will also have an opportunity to come to address many of the issues that are covered by my directorate in DG Mare. I mean, indeed, my services are dealing with many aspects that would be of interest of this committee, particularly the negotiation with the UK, with Norway, the consultation that we have also on the Svalbard process, NEAF, fisheries management in EU waters in the northern area from the Baltic Sea over the Skagerrak, the North Sea, the Channel, Bay of Biscay, the Bering Sea. So it's quite a range of topics that certainly occupy many of us for the second part of the year, but I can also reassure the member of this committee and yourself that we work quite a lot also at the beginning of the year to prepare all these negotiations, and that is the reason why it was indeed very interesting for us to be able to come here. In addition to the fisheries and specific fisheries aspect, we also cover environmental measures, protecting harbour porpoise in the Baltic Sea. We're also dealing with dolphins in the Bay of Biscay and setting the marine protected area via joint recommendation from the regional member states group. And again, the reason why I want to mention is that we have indeed a wide responsibility also to come in front of the Parliament, and particularly this committee, with proposals that then need to be addressed, discussed and adopted in order for the sector to have clarity on the rule. I've decided to come here also today with a short PowerPoint presentation here with my colleague dealing specifically with the Baltic, and as you say, we are quite happy then to take questions and to provide clarification for this very important aspect of the traditional setting of fishing opportunity, which is for the Baltic. We thought that it was, first of all, very important to give you an idea of what we are talking about. The Baltic Sea is a rather particular area which is affected by many challenges, and I think we only managed to list some of them in the slide that we have here, but I think they're quite telling. The Baltic Sea is naturally low on oxygen and salinity. This is already a state of play that indicates to you how difficult it is to manage fishery stock, and particularly biological aspect in relation to marine animals. So low of oxygen and salinity means also that it's an extremely fragile environment. And there is, as a sign of this, we have noticed, particularly through scientific literature, that we are not just dealing with situations where there is low of oxygen, but there are more and more oxygen-depleted area in the Baltic, which again pose an additional challenge to any of those who need to take management measures. And in addition to the already complex situation, we have eutrophication, which is caused by excessive nutrient loads and in combination with rising temperature. Again, this is an element that impacts severely also on the biology, on the biomass of the stock, in addition to the possibility for the water and for the sea to be able to provide a conducive environment for reproduction. We know that this is essentially also coming from other areas, and I think that we have made it very clear in all the intervention we have had so far, not just in the Council of Ministers, but also through specific initiatives that have been taken over the past few years, that we need to address this situation also through tackling other sectors, particularly in terms of their impact on the situation of the waters. And you know that, of course, this has been also done through quite a various EU legal instruments, which I'm not going to list here. But clearly the fact that we need to address the overall ecosystem approach in the Baltic is even more important in order to help to maintain an environment that is helping us also to provide sufficient environment for the fish stock. There are, of course, and I think that it's important, trade-off, and maybe even more than in other areas where we need to take decision, and ministers need to take decision about how to approach this particular sensitive area. Maybe we can move to the next slide, please. And now to go directly to what it means in terms of a proposal for this year, we consider that it was interesting to give you an idea of where we are in terms of proposal for the fishing opportunity, which, as you can see very much here, means a reduction in terms of numbers for many of the stock, and that is translated also in terms of direct reduction for the member states that are affected. And you will see that overall, and we can look at, of course, at the average, we're talking about a reduction in the proposal on the TEN-TAC of about 8%. But of course, disparities are have to be addressed because there are different situations for each of the member states, situation also because of the particular interests of those member states. Next slide, please. And I want to start by presenting the detail of the proposal, but of course highlighting the very serious situation in which we have been now for several years for the cod. And we went from an extremely high biomass to something that is extremely reduced, meaning that the only fishing opportunities that were adopted by the Council over the past few years were for bycatch only. Clearly, cod is one of these stock that is suffering extremely also from the quality of the environment. We know that the cod die from factors, many others than fishing, that the animals themselves, and this has been proven also by the scientists, are not in a situation where they can properly reproduce. The quality and the size of the individual are smaller than they were in the past. And in addition to that, they are faced with many diseases, which is again an indication that we are just dealing with a population that is extremely fragile, but that also has many problems in terms of reproducing and therefore going back to the level that we have seen in the past. The proposal has been, from our side, in order to be fully in line with not just the CFP basic regulation, but also with the Baltic multi-annual plan, to go to a TAC reduction which is exactly in line with the reported landing in 2023. And that means that we are look at possibility to now go down to minus 72% for the Western cod and for the Indus cod to minus 68%. What is very important, on the other hand, is not just that we address the situation by reducing the TAC and therefore the fishing effort, but also that we are looking at the remedial measures. And that means that we are also proposing in this 2025 fishing opportunity to maintain those measures that have been addressed and that have been also devised with the stakeholders. So cod, and I think that is really the message in a nutshell, remains in an extremely severe situation. We see very little sign of recovery. We need to address that, and of course, we need also to lower even further the fishing pressure. Let me come to maybe we can go to the next slide, please. And here for the remaining part, except for salmon and plaice. And I think I'd like also to make a few comments here. First of all, we need to address the very serious situation for the pelagic stocks. Western herring, this year ICES gave again a zero catch advice. And like last year, the Commission is of the view that in this circumstance, we need to apply the Article 4.6 of the Baltic map to close all the targeted fisheries without the possibility of exception. The existing derogation for small-scale fishermen to target Western herring has to stop. And in other words, it means that only bycatch should be allowed. And that is the reason why we propose a reduction of the TAC, which goes from minus 50% compared to last year. Again, fully in line with the Baltic map, with the Article 4.6, and in order to be sure that we are providing solution for the recovery of this very emblematic stock in the same way that for the other herrings. The second stock is central herring. And here we have a situation which is above the absolute minimum biomass level, which for those who know about can be called BLM. This said, it's still not above the biomass, the healthy biomass level, which we call PECH record. Those are two important aspects and figures that help us to decide which article and how we are constructing the Commission proposal. In this particular case, the Commission proposed to be rather prudent and to set the TAC at the lowest MSY point, giving us the possibility to increase by 180% the TAC compared to 2024. I have to say that while, of course, the Commission has been very careful in making this proposal, we still need to look at the overall dynamic of the stock. And therefore, we feel that this is a reasonable proposal to put in the table. in order to allow to maintain the fishery on the central herring. For the Botnian herring, the next one in the slide, this is a stock that is again very much below the healthy level of what we call the B trigger. The scientists are telling us that if the TAC was set at the MSY point value, which is basically the MSY figure that we have in the advice, the biomass would decrease even further. And that is, of course, very worrying for the stakeholders. So we need to make sure that we are proposing a figure here that provides for, on the one hand, a certain level of predictability in the fishing activities, but also help the stock to recover. And that's why for the Botnian herring, we have made a proposal that is still quite reasonable compared to the advice, and we are proposing plus 21%. For the Riga herring, the Commission has taken note, of course, of the rather positive advice coming from ICES, so the stock is doing, let's say, fine. And here we are proposing to set the TAC at the MSY point value of plus 10%. This is one of the, I would say, probably easier case, but the information we have here is that, of course, we hope that there will be no further impact on the rest of the fisheries. And finally, the last stock on the pelagic for Sprat. Here again, we need to apply the Article 46 of the Baltic map, and we need to propose a TAC which is at the MSY lowest point in order for the probability of the stock not to fall below the BLIM. That means that for the Commission, the only option here is to provide for a proposal that consider minus 42%, and in this particular case, the advice range do not fulfill the condition of Article 0.6, so we don't have flexibility, in other words, under this Baltic multi-annual plan. Next slide, please. And here we are coming now to the two remaining stock, or group of stock, which is salmon and plaice. Maybe if we can push the button for the next slide. But otherwise, I can anticipate you for the Baltic and for the salmon. So for the main basin salmon, following the ISS advice, the TAC is only for bycatchers. In this particular case, since there's been rather complicated and challenging work done by the scientists, we have taken into account the fact that the ISS has provided a catch advice of minus 36%, which is basically the proposal we've made. In addition to that, I need to highlight that for salmon, because of course of the mixing between wild salmon and farm salmon, we also need to make sure that we have all the possibility to look at the mixing. In this particular case for the main basin, the Commission has also proposed to maintain a ban on the recreational fishing. You see, for the Gulf of Finland salmon, this is a particular situation, and here the ISS has decided to reduce the catch advice by 20%. Again, in this particular case, when we read the advice, it is very clear that there are a number of uncertainties, and I believe that by doing so, ISS has taken the most prudent approach, and the Commission proposed to follow the ISS advice as well in the case of the Gulf of Finland. Particular case for plaice that I need to highlight, because there are a lot of plaice in the sea. But the stock is not doing well, particularly in terms of size of the individual. They are very small, they're very thin, and that is an indication that the stock of plaice is, no matter what fish, meeting a certain number of difficulties. In addition to that, fishing for plaice has an impact on cod. There are a number of bycatch of cod in the plaice, and therefore, for this particular TAC, the Commission has proposed to take the TAC and change, and this is a rollover compared to 2024. And here, this is to conclude on the content itself of the fishing opportunity proposal, 10 stocks in total. Maybe we can go to the next slide, which gives you a little bit of summary in terms of what it means in relation to the objectives set for the PSC. So in terms of MSY points, so really to focus on the advice and the MSY figure provided by ISS, we have one stock in the Gulf of Riga herring. We have no stock for which we can apply the flexibility regime that is provided by the Baltic multi-annual plan, so nothing on the MSY upper. On the other hand, based on ISS advice, as well as other consideration in the advice, the Commission has proposed for two stocks to go at the MSY lower. This is the lower part of the range that we can apply following the multi-annual plan, and that is for Central and Bottian herring. Below the MSY lowest, that means that this is really in case we have a situation of particular concern, but not yet at the stage where we have an obligation to trigger the Article 0.46. We are looking at two stocks, Sprat and Place. Now, since we do not only have MSY advice, we also have to look at the precautionary advice. That is the case for the Gulf of Finland salmon, where we are proposing bycatch only. For Western herring, Western cod and Eastern cod is exactly the same situation, and you remember that in the very first slide, the focus that I've made on the situation of cod. We wanted also to highlight a very special case for the main basin salmon. And otherwise, for this, we also look at the bycatch. Again, I have to insist on this, that ISS finds it quite difficult sometimes to provide an advice on the salmon. This is also related to the fact that it has been challenging also for the member states to provide sometimes the necessary capacity in terms of science to allow for an advice to come, an MSY advice. Last but not least, because again, we are not just looking at a reduction in terms of figures, but we're also looking at the other side of the management regime. Remedial measures need to remain in place. Western herring, Western cod, Eastern cod, and the main basin salmon. Next slide, please, and I've nearly finished. I just wanted to use this opportunity also to recall that the proposal, the way it is built, the way it is discussed, the way it is decided at the Commission level before, of course, the final discussion in the October Council, goes through a certain number of steps. We have extensive discussion with stakeholders, as I said, the Boilfish Forum, Boilfish High-Level Group. I was myself in Berlin and was extremely pleased to be able to attend and to engage with the stakeholders on this very important aspect. We, of course, are talking about the traditional presentation of the Council Working Group. We came a bit earlier to the Parliament, and it was very welcome to be able also to present the content of the proposal as well as the way we have to address a certain number of issues coming out from the advice. And finally, of course, it will be then prepared at the level of the ambassadors before we go to the Council in October. This is concluding my presentation, and of course, as I said, we are very happy with my colleague to provide any further clarification. Thank you.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. Donatello. I'll now give the floor to the members, beginning with the Vice Chair, Ms. Borja.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thank you to the Commission for coming along to our committee meeting. Now, we know that the situation in the Baltic is critical, and the Baltic Sea is one of the most polluted seas in the world. We know that a number of small-scale fishers are being driven out of work after generations doing their activity, others that cannot actually continue in the profession because there is not enough by way of catch. The herring stocks have been so poor that there's been a suggestion by the Commission that they should stop fishing. Now an increase is being proposed for the central Baltic area. And my question to the Commission, therefore, is whether the Commission itself thinks that this is a strategy that could guarantee that we would get a long-term sustainable fishery with the sustainable levels for the Baltic. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Ms. Vista? Thank you so much for this presentation and for being here, but I am quite astonishing what's actually being recommended here. I'm not questioning the science on which this is based, but it's just so evident that the science and the numbers that we're looking at here it is not enough. It doesn't cover the complete situation of the fish stocks in the Baltic Sea. And as the Commission is underlining in your report, and as been raised by science researchers and the scientific advice all across the Baltic Sea, the maximum sustainable yield doesn't cover the full stock condition of this Baltic Sea. We see that older individuals are much smaller, and that the only way of recovering to have decent fishing of herring in the Baltic is to put quotas to a bare minimum. This was also the Commission advice the last time you were here, gave us advice, and now it's not only raised the quotas, it's actually being tripling the quotas. For me, I just don't see how this sums up, how that can be called responsibility and taking responsibility of the fish stocks. So the conditions are alarming, and we know that, for the last 30 years, the fish stocks has been under the minimum levels, and that the numbers since 2020 are hugely uncertain. How can we still then now recommend increasing quotas with a factor of 108% in the central, for the central herring? For me, that's completely unreasonable, and I'm wondering, within the current framework, what can we do to better take all of the factors into consideration when recommending new quotas? Or is it only the review of the CFP that's the only way forward here? But there must be something we can do when the numbers are so uncertain and when the scientific base is simply so uncertain. That's my both remark and question. I also have a second question, is regarding the Russian fishing in the Baltic Sea, and if the Commission has any way or estimate of the control of the outtake from the Baltic Sea from Russia, and what have been done there since the war in Ukraine. Thank you so much for being here. Very important discussion.
Señora Levin.
Ms. Levin, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, the Commission, for the presentation. My questions are around two main topics. One is on the science. So the Commission now explained a number of times how uncertain the scientific advice is. And if you read the actual proposal from the Commission, it states that until 2019, decisions of Baltic Sea fishing opportunities were in line with all stocks with MSY. But then in 2019, something happened. It became apparent that the Eastern Baltic cod had been under severe pressure, and in 2021, it became apparent that the Western Baltic cod had been below the B-lim conservation reference point for many years. Then, if we look at the herring, the Central Baltic herring was below B-trigger for many years. Since 2023, the biomass has actually been around B-lim since the mid-90s and below B-lim for several years. So, in view of this, that ICES has revised its advice and its stock assessment so many times and to such a degree, can the Commission really say that these proposals are in line with the CFP when it comes to the precautionary approach, when it comes to the ecosystem approach, when it comes to the ultimate target of Article 2.2 to rebuild stocks and preserve them above levels that can produce a maximum sustainable yield? When it comes to the Central Baltic herring, you said that it's at MSY lowest, but it's also a really huge risk still of collapse, and we don't know how much herring there is because of all the misreporting as well. So my question is, instead of just issuing new proposals, why isn't the Commission proposing a rebuilding plan for the Baltic Sea stocks? We should need a totally new approach and not just continue with based on very, very fragile data to try to help a sea that the Commission also is saying is extremely fragile. So we need a new approach. Why isn't the Commission proposing such a new approach? We still have a traditional plan, but the traditional plan has failed, so we need something new. It's too important not to do that. My second question is around the ecosystem approach. So is the Commission planning to ask ICES for multi-species considerations in relation to and between cod, sprat and herring? We know there's a lot of misreporting. We know that the feed for many of these species aren't in the locations where they should be. We see the cod is starving, we see the salmon is starving, we see even the herring is very, very thin. So we need to have a different type of advice from ICES. What is the Commission doing? Are you planning to ask for multi-species real ecosystem considerations when before issuing any proposals of TACs? So these are really, really serious questions, and we have a serious situation, as the Commission underlined. So we need a new approach. Why isn't the Commission coming up with such an approach? Thank you.
Señor Müller.
Mr. Müller.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Commission for this presentation. And the discussion has been very interesting, and I would like to elaborate on this discussion. First of all, the approach by the Commission makes the fisheries experts and puts them in a very uncomfortable position. We have a lot of different differences, and these considerations are very often misleading. But I would like to say what we can do, and I would like to touch upon one issue. This is preventing the negative environmental consequences. This is about activities and issues related to the ammunitions that are remaining at the bottom of the Baltic Sea from the Second World War. This is a very important issue. We dealt with it before, but in a couple of years this may bring serious impact, and this is something we can do. We can preempt the situation and undertake some activities. I would like to ask the Commission about this area of activity. And the second area is the pollution of the Baltic Sea. We have different types of activities, business activities in the Baltic. There is also a lot of sewage water that flows into the Baltic, and I think that we should be more proactive when it comes to the using of funds from the cohesion funds, use the cohesion funds in order to remedy the situation in that area, because this is the only way to find solutions to the problems that affect different stocks in the Baltic Sea, stocks which are depleting. And instead of focusing on counting limits, quotas, I think that the Commission should seek some solutions, some reasons which underline this very unstable situation in the Baltic. Thank you.
Señora Casper.
Ms. Casper.
Tack, fru ordförande.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to be speaking Swedish. Now, we're all familiar with the incredibly serious situation in the Baltic Sea, and when the Commission recently was describing it, saying quite how serious this was and how biological diversity is at risk, the situation concerning stocks, to concerning eutrophication and the spreading of toxins, etc., and that we have to take an overall approach. Well, in addition to that, now we've got the Russian shadow fleet, which is a potential environmental threat or potentially a catastrophe every day, given that they are out there sailing with unsafe vessels in our inland waters. But we are now today focusing on the survival of fish stocks, and it has been a negative trend now for a very long time. And we've heard today the Commission's presentation, and in listening to it we get very surprised and extremely concerned. The situation is very uncertain, and the numbers are very uncertain, and they're based upon uncertain assessments, and yet an increase of 108% is being suggested for one of these. Now, obviously, it's a good thing that we are able to have this debate here, but we do have to understand what is behind numbers of that kind, given the background against which this is taking place. There are a lot of aspects to this, but one of them is the fact that we're seeing a lot of fluctuation from year to year in these recommendations, and it's only the big operators that can survive now. It's going to be a sort of death blow to the local small-scale sustainable fishery. When we met here a few weeks ago, I placed a rhetorical question to the Commission on that occasion. Who is it that is going to benefit? Who are going to be the winners of this policy? And I didn't get an answer on that occasion, so let me repeat that question once again. Who will be the winners? I think we need to stress that we are going to need to take a much longer term perspective rather than this one-year cycle in trying to get to grips with what's going on. And as a Swedish person, like most of my compatriots, I feel an almost sorrow about what's going on in the Baltic Sea, and I would really like to have a stronger message that the Commission was able to emit, taking a much bigger picture approach to the future of the Baltic Sea. For example, questions about how to protect fish against bottom trawling is something that needs to be looked into. But we do need this holistic approach. We need a total, starting from the bottom up, maybe in 15, 20 or 30 years' time, looking ahead, rather than bouncing around from year to year with these objectives. And that will ensure that our grandchildren will be able to eat fish from the Baltic Sea in the future and be able to swim in our common waters. Thank you.
Señor Druese.
Mr. Dresser.
Thank you very much. There were two colleagues that put a question already that I wish to put. It's about the future of the fishery and the state of the data. I think the Commission representative has been talking about the ecological state of the Baltic Sea, the low salinity and low oxygen levels. But what is of surprise to me is that we've got North Stream 2. There were explosions there. What's happened as a consequence of that? What about the gas that remains in that pipeline? And what fallout has there been on the offshore wind parks on stocks? So all of this is something that's on my mind. Somebody was talking about a sensible proposal by the Commission, and after all, in Germany we've got a fairly small fishing industry. But I think this proposal is leading to a situation where the German fishing industry, or the Baltic fishing industry, is going to suffer a grave blow, and we need to ensure that it can survive. It's not only the stocks, but the people. Then we need to strike the balance, and this Commission proposal is in principle the end, the death of fishing in the Baltic Sea, and I'm particularly surprised why this continued ban on leisure time fishing is being upheld. Maybe our colleague could tell us a little about that. There was also a proposal on the table. Sorry, the proposal that's on the table is one that we cannot support and we reject out of hand.
Cabral.
Mr. de Nascimento Cabral. Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon to all of the colleagues. I'd like to thank the Commission for the presentation on this proposal for the Baltic Sea in 2025. Very briefly, 2 points. The first, when it comes to the situation in the Baltic, the difficult environmental conditions, we're also talking about, of course, salinity and nutrients and eutrophication in the Baltic Sea. Now, the proposal, if we look at it, I'm most concerned about the small-scale fisheries. They only have this as their only livelihood, and that might actually sap their ability to be able to continue their business in the Baltic Sea. When it comes to cod, however, I have a specific question. It's obviously a product that is highly consumed in Portugal, and we can see that there is something of a 75% decrease in the cod. Now, if we look at the cod stock, it's not an issue of overfishing, however, it's the environmental conditions and the conditions of the species. Therefore, I should like to ask the Commission, in addition to this 75% decrease in the quota, what measures are being taken to be able to replenish the stock to make sure that we have healthier cod stocks? So in future years, we know that things have been difficult over the recent years where there have been measures taken, but I'd like to know what the long-term and the medium-term measures might be to be able to replenish that stock. Thank you.
Señora Eriksson.
Ms. Eriksson, please.
Thank you, Chair. I will be speaking in Swedish. First of all, I very much agree with what my Swedish colleagues have said, the ones that have spoken this afternoon. We know that the situation in the Baltic is extremely serious, and we've known that for a long time. There are colleagues here who've been working on this issue for years and who've been referring to it. And the development has been going in the wrong direction for a very long time, as just has been said by a number of colleagues. And we've heard from the Commission about how serious the situation is. So we're really shocked to be sitting here hearing that there's a proposed increase in the quota, 108%. So what are we going to do to understand this correctly? Well, it seems to me, certainly in Sweden, that people believe that a long-term sustainable fisheries policy is required for the Baltic Sea. Often people refer to the socio-economic aspects, and that is precisely what we're dealing with. Travelling around Sweden, this is what we hear from the small-scale coastal fishers. It's a social economic question, and we've got to get the sustainability aspect correct. I agree with the way that many people have been talking about this, but ultimately we need to think, what is behind all this? What is it, in fact, has resulted in this massive increase in the proposal? And I'm really worried that there is an economic interest behind this. There are not going to be many. There are going to be very, very few who will survive, and most of the small-scale fishers are going to go out of business. So we need to know what's behind this. Thank you.
Señor Donatella, tiene usted la palabra.
Mr. Donatella, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, let me thank all the members of this committee for the intervention, the question, and also the fact that in many cases concerns have been expressed, which are very much the concern that we have constantly also expressed over the past few years, whether it is in the context of the fishing opportunity, but also during a number of initiatives that we have taken, particularly addressing the impact of pollution, or, as it was mentioned, you see the unexploded ammunition in the Baltic Sea. Our previous commissioner has himself decided from the start not just to look at, of course, the obligation that we have in front of us, which is to present fishing opportunity proposal on the yearly basis, but also to have a wide approach for the Baltic, looking at all impact of all human activities on the quality of the sea basin, on the capacity of protecting important and critical fish stock, as well as, and I think it has been mentioned several times, by looking beyond and looking at the remedial measures. And when I'm saying remedial measure, of course, I can stick to what is included into the legislation, but clearly from the perspective that we have had in this initiative, it is about also looking at how we can help restocking, how we can help reproduction, how we can protect spawning areas, how we can make sure that control activities are being more efficient, how we can improve the quality also of the communication between member states. And you know that one of the very important role of our European agency is particularly to ensure that there is a common and consistent approach in terms of control and monitoring, how we can make sure that data collection is implemented in such a way that we have the elements and ICES as the element to provide the annual advice on the stock. Those are only a few of the elements on which the Commission has been working extensively with the member states. And from our side, this is absolutely clear that the management of the Baltic stock cannot just be seen from the angle of an annual fishing opportunity exercise. It is, of course, also an extremely challenging area because it goes well beyond the pure fisheries management aspect. And that is the reason why we need also to call on all the stakeholders and also member states and regional local authorities, as well as the support from the Parliament, to make sure that we are in a position to have a wider debate about how to approach the Baltic Sea. Why am I mentioning also member states' authorities? A number of decisions to be taken in policy which are beyond fisheries cannot be taken by the Commission, or they cannot be taken only by the Council. This is particularly important where we talk about how to protect areas, how to make sure that some of the areas that we know are sensitive, particularly for the reproduction, can be designated also in the context of the delegated act and the joint recommendation. There are a certain number of elements here on which the Commission is constantly working with all this intervention. And I just wanted to say that as an outset in my reaction to your question, very important question. A couple of times it was also mentioned the impact of the Russian activities. I have to admit that this is one of the areas where we feel that for the time being, we have to rely on the advice and on the data that are provided to us by international institute, the capacity and the possibility for us, of course, to go deeper into an analysis of the activities and the data is hampered by the current situation. This is, however, a matter of concern. It has been expressed also several times, including at the last councils, where we know that there's been questions raised about not just the impact of the activity in terms of fishing, but also the impact of some of the activities on the quality of the environment. And I also would like to reassure this committee that this is a matter that we know perfectly well as one of the most sensitive. I just wanted again to say that this was also a difficulty in the past, and let's not just look at the current situation. Interacting with the Russian authorities before 2019, before 2020, on the basis of the other ICES advice was equally challenging, and that is, of course, a situation that has not been, that we cannot address for the time being. Several times also intervention took place about how to look at the future. And again, here I would like to repeat what I said at the very beginning of my second intervention. We have an obligation to propose fishing opportunities on an annual basis based on the best scientific advice that we have available. We are actually quite lucky in the Baltic, on the other hand, with the quality of the data that have allowed the scientists and ICES in particular, to provide an MSY advice, except for, and not entering into the particular situation of salmon, but except for Western herring, we are always looking at MSY advice, which means that ICES has the capacity to provide an advice that meets the requirement for providing a figure on which we can base our proposal. Then, of course, we have the possibility also under the Baltic multi-annual plan to go into a lower or higher, a upper range, and that is what the Commission has done here. There were quite a few questions about how credible are the figures that we have proposed, particularly for central herring. I just wanted to also make here a clarification. The ICES advice that we have for central herring, advising an increase of 175%. You see that the Commission has not just taken a figure from the advice, we have assessed also everything related to the stock, the biomass, the outlook. And that is the reason why the Commission in its proposal has to also take into consideration other elements. The result, which may be quite surprising, is actually a result that is very precautionary compared to the original advice for all the reasons that have been said. The mixing, the possibility that we look at reproduction recruitment, and also the possibility that we are seeing a different outlook in the context of the benchmark that ICES will provide. And all this to say that going from 175% as an advice to 108% as a proposal is already an indication that we are suggesting very seriously to look at it from a very cautious point of view. There were also a number of questions about ecosystem approach and whether we are in talks or we are considering. I can confirm that this has been part of our ongoing interaction with ICES in particular. We also know that from the scientific point of view, this is an extremely challenging and complex issue. And coming from this interaction, we are not convinced that for the time being we are already in a position to obtain an advice that will be different in terms of type and in terms of quality. And again, I wanted to say that this is a constant work that is being done by the scientists. This is, of course, something on which we are working not just for the Baltic, but also for the sea basin. This said, we have also to accept that science can show sometime that there is a limitation about the prediction and the capacity to assess not just the biology of one or several stocks, but also the impact of the overall environment about how a stock will perform, particularly in the medium to the longer term. There was also a question in particular about cod. And I think, again, I wanted to reiterate that here, the Commission proposal, and it is since 2017, has put in place or has proposed that the Member States put in place also additional remedial measures. One of them is the protection of the juveniles, so of the reproduction, of the spawning areas, and this is certainly one of the important factors that, if continued, should allow for a recovery of the stock at some point in time. But cod, as we know, is not a stock that can recover very quickly. Collapse has been established, and it would take time, indeed, that we look at a different situation in terms of the biomass. And last, from all the questions that have been also expressed, it's about, I would say, the socio-economic impact of the proposal. Livelihood, of course, of the stakeholders, all those who have an activity that depends on the fishing activity. Again, we are looking at those elements in parallel to the fishing opportunity, not because we do not consider that important, but because legally speaking, we have a different instrument here that is available for those who are affected by any reduction into the fishing opportunities. The question is really how to make sure that we can accompany the measures in order to be able to fit within, of course, the obligation and the rules of the Fisheries Fund, but also to help us into the long term. Just to conclude on that, addressing the situation in the Baltic is not something that we do through only the annual fishing opportunity cycle. It is a long term. We are working on it. We are deeply involved. And of course, being in the long term on such a critical area, we know that it's going to be a rather big challenge to make sure that we can see progress in the very near future. From the Commission, I can confirm that it is our full commitment. Thank you.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. Donatella. Very briefly, Ms. Lövin.
Thank you very much. Regarding best available science, and that is what the tax should be based on. Regarding Central Baltic herring, the status of the biomass of the stock has been uncertain since 2020. ICES undertook a benchmark study in 2023 and then estimated that the biomass has been below BLIM for most of the past 30 years, including in 2023. And then of the short-term forecast for the stock development results in a catch advice that would almost triple the TAC compared to 2024. However, this forecast, and this is what ICES explicitly states, is that it's based on uncertain assessment of an optimistic recruitment, and also estimates that with no fishing at all, the probability that the stock will remain below B trigger in 2026 is 55%. I'm just saying this because this is not the way that we should be managing our fish stocks according to the common fisheries policy. We should rebuild and maintain stocks above levels that should produce a maximum sustainable yield. And the Commission must be the guardian of this and take another approach. Thank you.
Señora Wiesner, de forma...
Ms. Wiesner, also very briefly, please.
Just a brief remark and a follow-up, because it's not also us questioning the figure, it's actually ICES themselves questioning the figure, and this documentation provided to us questioning the figure. So, I mean, on the basis of what Isabella just said, I mean, it's absolutely rational to question the figure, and the question is, should we then take political decision based on a figure with such an amount of uncertainty? For a really long time, the stock has been under BLIM. For almost 30 years, the stock has been under, and just because now, 1 year in the data, based on a very large uncertainty, we're now tilted over, and that has severe consequences on the recommended levels. For me, it's also clear that the maximum sustainable yield might have been working in several other sea basins, but to cover the situation in the Baltic Sea, it's simply not enough. This figure, it's not enough advice to then decide on quotas. So my question were, how can we, within the current framework that we have, make sure that other indicators are also valid and also looked at in this? Because we know that researchers are saying that the size of the individuals, the age distribution of the individuals, and I mean, all of the other parameters not measured in the maximum sustainable yield, everything is pointing at that we are on the rank of a collapse of the fish stock, of the herring. So it's not a question about us questioning data or in science. It's that this data point is very uncertain and that this data point is not enough.
Señora Casbro, también de forma breve.
Ms. Casbro, also please, briefly.
Tack.
Thank you. And thank you very much to the Commission for their answer. To save the Baltic Sea, we're going to have more cooperation, and we're going to have a policy based on science. And I would very much like to repeat and refer to what has been said by my colleague Isabella Lövin. We have the science. We're talking to the scientists, and we've got the voices of the commercial fishers and the leisure fishers. We are talking to all of these people. We know that there are no fish. And this is likely to undermine trust in the common fisheries policy of the EU, with implications for the whole of EU cooperation. That makes me extremely concerned.
Señor Donatella, si quiere usted.
Mr. Donatella, if you can please comment on the points raised by the members.
Yes, Madam Chair, very quickly, and again, I would like to thank you for the intervention. I would just repeat those elements in the sense that for us, what is important is that we look at really the content of the advice, and the headline advice is very clear. We have taken the headline advice for the central hearing. We have made sure that we have applied also all the elements that we have in the Baltic multi-annual plan. The Commission fully share, of course, all the intervention that you have had, but it remains that we have to make a proposal for the decision by the Council of Ministers on the best available scientific advice, which is the only one we have, which is ICES. I also wanted to say that on the quality of data, and again, I have to repeat what I said, we know that we have to dissociate on one hand what is available to the national and ICES scientists, and on the other hand, we have also to make sure that we have a good understanding of the approach that was taken in the context of advice, particularly touching at integrating other factors into the development of the stock. For us, in order to be absolutely careful in the decision-making process, we believe that the proposal that we've made is providing a certain guarantee that we can go ahead with a proposal such as the one that we have made. At the same time, and here I'm going to stop here after, it is equally clear that we cannot just look at the figure only in terms of management of the fishery, and certainly for us, it needs continue to have remedial measures for most of the stock for which we have had to propose a reduction. So that is the way we look at it. And of course, debating on science is equally important for us than debating on the final figures. And we are ready to continue to do that, not just with ICES, but of course, also for all those who can contribute. And here I have to say, particularly the fishermen who are the first ones who are able sometime to provide quality of data, not just of data, but quality of the assessment about what is happening in the Baltic Sea, maybe more than even in other sea basins. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Donatella. If we may then, let us conclude on this item and move on to item 5, which is about the cuts in the anchovy quotas in the Atlantic Iberian waters for 2024 and 2025. This item is on the agenda because it's a topical subject. The Spanish sector has called for help, expressing their concern at the decision adopted on the 2nd of September by the Commission setting the fisheries opportunities for certain fish stocks applicable in waters of the Union for 2024, 2025 and 2026, which, among other things, would mean a swingeing cut of 54% in the anchovy quotas in the Atlantic Iberian waters from July 2024 until July 2025. I understand that the legal basis for this proposal is Article 43, Paragraph 3 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and therefore it's the Agri-Fish Council, which is meeting today, in fact, that will take the final decision. Nonetheless, we would like to understand in more detail how the Commission arrived at this proposal, because it seems to the sector that the cuts proposed are excessively harsh and will severely affect not only the fleet in Spain and in Portugal. They will severely undermine their economic viability. So I'd like to begin by giving the floor to Mr. Fabrizio Donatella, Director of DG Mare, so that you can summarize the situation and inform us more about how this decision was arrived at. Mr. Donatella.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, let me again thank you very much for inviting me today to present the Commission proposal on anchovy in the Iberian Sea. I have to indeed thank you for that opportunity. And as you said correctly, the matter is currently being discussed in the Council, which are left, and I will go back immediately after. And this is really one of the main topics today of the discussion. And I think that it came in a timely manner that we are also able in front of this committee to provide some clarification about how the Commission has elaborated the proposal and how we look at it, and also provide clarification about the content of what we have put on the table of the Council of Ministers. And since I'm used this afternoon to make PowerPoint presentation, I will immediately go to the very first slide. And I just wanted to take a little bit of time just to present a little bit the framework in which we're operating. We have received an ICES advice on the 21st of June for an advice for a 12-month tag going from 1st of July to 30th of June 2025. It's important to say that in the meantime, we have taken a decision, the Council has taken a decision to apply a provisional tag to allow the sector to have a certain level of predictability and also to maintain an activities. And this has been a decision that allow for a period of time to maintain, as I said, this activity. Unfortunately, the assess advice we received on the 21st of June confirmed an extremely preoccupying situation that has been already highlighted in the past few years, and namely that the stock is not doing well. Not only it doesn't do well, but you can see that the size of the advice in terms of reduction, minus 50%, minus 54% decrease in TAC, is actually quite substantial for the whole area. In addition to that, the traditional approach that we have applied for years for these fisheries is, despite the fact that there are two components, and I come back to it now in a minute, that those components can be exploited at the same time with a capacity of flexibility regime, let me say it like that. ICES, for the very first time in the headline advice, has highlighted that for the new period, the management of this stock, of these stocks, cannot be done anymore at the component. They have to be done at the component level. That means that the flexibility regime that we've had, fishing a little bit more in one area versus in another area, swapping is really creating an additional challenge for the management of the stock and for the recovery of the stock. I wanted to insist on that because while, of course, the figure may be the most, I would say, evident element here coming from this deterioration of the stock, the mention and the fact that it is very clear from the scientist, for the scientists, that we need to manage those two components in a separate manner is certainly one of the major novelty of the ICES advice. So this is what we had in front of us on the 21st of June and which was the base of the following approach by the Commission, which is the proposal. If we can go to the next slide, please. And in the proposal, you can see immediately the reflection of what we had in the advice. We also wanted to look a little bit at what happened in the past and try to understand whether there was a sudden reduction of the biomass or there were causes that we could identify. And what we've seen is that the fishing, and we have two components, in the southern component in the past 2 years, were about 470% of what ICES advised. And the same for the 2023-2024. So the question here is the fact that there has been already an enormous pressure on the stock, particularly on the most fragile and sensitive component. So we have, of course, to take the ICES advice in effect. And since we are talking about an MSY advice, we do not have the possibility, like we've seen in the Baltic for some stock, to apply an upper range or low range. It's really about the MSY advice. And in addition to that, the Commission has proposed to stop what we call the swaps between member states, in Article 16 of the basic regulation, not because we wanted to create an additional limitation and difficulties, but because through those swaps, the pressure on the southern component became too important and put at risk the recovery of the stock. Next slide, please. The provisional tag was set at 4,997 tons until the 30th of September. This is the situation in which the fleets are operating for the time being. And the reason why we have this amount is because we took into consideration the fact that there was a legitimate expectation from the fleet to have this amount and to allow to continue. And we also proposed that we could go into a situation where the caps could be provisioned up to more or less the same amount. So we tried to make sure that in our proposal we were able to not only translate the SA's advice, but also to take into consideration a very important element here, which was the legitimate expectation from the stakeholders to be in a position to continue the activities after the provisional period. Next slide, please. And since there were questions about how the Commission came to this proposal, important to say that, of course, the MSY is a legal limit for the Commission and the Council. This is, in a nutshell, the translation of the objectives and obligation we have under the CFP rules. We know, and we have taken that very much into consideration in all the interaction we have had with the Member States, that a reduction of the tax of minus 54% has obviously severe impact to the sector. We also know that if we do not put such a proposal on the table for decision, the impact will be even higher in case we have a collapse of the stock. And again, I want to emphasize that the concern here is essentially on the southern component. That has demonstrated to be extremely fragile and not providing with sufficient indication that there is adequate recruitment and reproduction. In the past, we have also seen that overall, the catch utilization, so the quota uptake, has been to a certain extent quite limited, in the sense that we have never seen a situation where it has reached the 100%. And so we need also to look at what minus 54 compared to a catch utilization of less than 100% can see. Next slide, please. I also wanted to anticipate a number of questions about why in this particular situation we have not applied a certain number of other decisions or articles that we have applied in the past for different stock. The very first one is about the so-called choke situation. So the flexibility regime that the CFP basic regulation can provide in the case we are dealing with a stock. That is what we call a choke. That means that by stopping activities, we stop other activities. This is not the case for the anchovy. It is a directed fishery. It is not a choke situation. And therefore, the flexibility that the CFP allow for choke situation cannot apply in the context of anchovy. We know, and it has been said several times, that indeed the limitation that we need to implement in order to be fully in line with the advice will have impact, in particularly for the sector in Cadiz. We also know that it is an issue that is complex for the Commission to fully address, because quota are managed at national level. And while, of course, we know perfectly well what are the sensitivity and the impact at the coastal communities and local level, the Commission has to make a proposal that look at an overall TAC for the stock, and of course, this TAC is then divided among the member states according to relative stability. This said, how the management is done at national level is, of course, entirely in the hand of the national authorities. And certainly, we need to look at how we are going now to move forward. Is there another slide?
Next is
and the last slide, please. So what we absolutely need to look at is what is going to happen next. stock for which data is not an issue, where we know that ICES are provided with a certain level of confidence, the advice is an extremely worrying signal that we need to address. We also know that the stock has been declining since 2021, and it has to be, of course, a decision that is of the resort of the Council of Ministers. A very final point in the sense that we know that there's been also quite a lot of discussion surrounding the future advice. And ICES has been very clear that a benchmark is being prepared. In actual fact, we know that it may be issued already as of next week or in the coming 10 days. This benchmark is an exercise that the scientists have to undertake in order to ensure that the models and also the way the advice is delivered is really in line with the latest development in terms of knowledge, in terms of data, but also in terms of activities. Whether that exercise will lead to a new advice, it's really in the hand of scientists. We also know that we may end up in a situation where a new advice will be released in order to look at not anymore a 12-month period between 2 years, but a 12-month calendar year, so from 1st of January and 31st of December. What is clear, however, from all the contacts that we have had so far, is that the confirmation of the existence of 2 stocks, biological stock, will be confirmed in that context. So in a nutshell, and I will stop here because I've taken too much of the time, I just want to reiterate that we have made a very concrete proposal based on an extremely solid advice. The headline advice indicates that the management of these stocks cannot be done anymore by mixing the activities. We need to be extremely careful also to look at the viability of the activities, and therefore the question here is really what can be done in addition to this proposal in order to rebuild the stock. And I will stop here. Happy to provide, of course, clarification. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Señor Millán Mon.
Mr. Millán Mon.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Donatella, for your presentation and your explanations. This is a very sensitive question. As the Chair has already said, she stressed how important this issue was. The Commission proposal limiting the fishing opportunities for anchovy in such a way is not good news. I know you do have the ICES report of the 21st of June, but we do hope there'll be a new ICES report on the general state of the stock. But the TAC proposed, the reduced TAC, is a 54% reduction. As Mr. Donatella said, this is a major cut, and there's an additional restriction for the southern component, the southern zone, which is basically the Bay of Cadiz, where basically all that's allowed is 969 tons. There's going to be a massive cut for the regional fleet, which depends heavily on anchovy. All I want to say is that I hope that the ministers in the Council today will correct the Commission proposal. I suppose that's what they'll be discussing. They perhaps haven't got a solution yet. And I also hope that for the future, the Commission will also take into account 3 aspects of sustainability, not purely environmental sustainability, but also economic and social sustainability, along the lines of the Court of Justice ruling of the 11th of January this year, as you're very well aware, Mr. Donatella. And while I have the floor, I would like to point out as a positive that the Commission did finally take into account the socio-economic aspects for the POLAC quota. The tax for this year, we're initially proposing a 53% cut, an extremely drastic cut, which would have had a huge economic impact because this is a mixed fishery. It's a choke species entailing quota suspension. But the Commission was only taking into account the state of the stocks and not the socio-economic situation. And finally, the Commission saw a reason, following Member States' protests, and the Scientific, Technical and Economic Committee of the Fisheries drafted a report on the socio-economic impact, that's STEFC, and that has now been corrected. And I hope that the Council of Ministers will confirm that correction and substantially increase the pollock quota, which is extremely important for my country. And we look forward to the good news of the confirmation of that correction. And the economic and social impact should always be taken into account when considering quotas. It must not be solely the environmental aspects that we focus on. All aspects of sustainability need to be taken into account. And I hope that in future we will have a system whereby we don't look just at IC's data, but also the economic and social impact data. Thank you.
Señor Rodríguez.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Perdón, González Casares.
Sorry, Mr. González Casares. Thank you, Madam Chair. This proposal is extremely worrying. This is why we wanted to have the debate today, because of the huge impact that this Commission proposal will have, primarily in the Bay of Cadiz. Initially, we were expecting a quota of 2,300. Following the ICES report, the TAC recommended now is tantamount to the closure of the fishery, because the fleet has already used up 2,100 tonnes. And this at a time where we are still awaiting a further report in the coming weeks from ICES on the stock. This is going to have serious repercussions. The purse seine fleet of the Bay of Cadiz is made up of 75 vessels that focus on sardine and anchovy. And the sardines only have a 3-month fishing period. The cuts actually will represent 75% of real catch. So it's of existential concern. The fleet is dependent on anchovy to the tune of over 75%, so it's extremely sensitive to any changes in the TAC. Of course, all of us are committed to the sustainable management of fisheries. My country, my government here, the members here, and the Commission should start trying to reflect on the real impact of their policies. The Commission is not taking into account all aspects of sustainability, as Mr. Miamon has rightly pointed out. Not just the environmental aspect, of course that's important, but the social and economic impacts are conspicuous for their absence in the decision-making process here. Quite sincerely, I hope that what the Commissioner has in his mission letter will be heeded. In other words, that the social and economic aspects of these decisions will be taken into account. Once again, this is a decision that is going to cause major alarm and is already having an impact on the economy of the area. I mean, I know this is being discussed in Council, but please, Commission, reflect on this, withdraw this report, withdraw this proposal, come forward with a new proposal that takes into account as well the natural year in the management of anchovy stocks.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I should like to add my voice to the Spanish colleagues' concerns. Anchovy fishing is a high source of income for Portuguese fishers, and this 54% reduce in the quota is of great concern. And in about 30% of some of the fishing areas are only anchovy fisheries, so that would mean a 50% drop in the income of these very fishers. Now, of course, it's extremely important for us to have the information and the presentation from the Commission. But we need, of course, to factor in the three aspects of sustainability, the social and economic aspects in addition to the environment. And I hope that once we have the benchmarking exercise, we will have an improvement in the Commission's proposal. We know also that the ministers in the Agri-Fish Council are, I hope, for Spain and Portugal's sake, able to achieve a balanced approach. Now, for this anchovy quota, of course, but for all of the other quotas too, factoring in the three aspects, social, economic, and environmental sustainability, so that we make the right decision with regard to these quotas. Thank you.
Miranda Paz.
Sí, muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Chair. That fish do not know borders. Now, of course, the communities that are highly dependent on fishing are extremely concerned, but that concern is reflected around the country as a whole. The area subdivisions, for example, 9A, and it doesn't make sense that we would have something that would go from the Cadiz Bay all the way up to Galicia. We can see that there is somewhat of an accumulation of vessels in the anchovy fishing. When, for example, there's a closure in one place, then often there is a shift. Fish do not understand restrictions on quotas. They move for other reasons. And when we look at the restrictions that have been placed on the anchovy fishing in previous years, we have been reading the information from ICES for a long time, and we need to factor in the three areas of sustainability, the social and economic aspects as well. But if we don't have clean waters, we've talked about the Baltic Sea previously, and we've seen precisely what happens when the waters are contaminated. And when the water is not properly treated, that has a huge impact on the social and economic sustainability. Moreover, in recent years, there have been drastic cuts when it comes to anchovies. The situation has improved, yet we've seen a major drop in the sector. That means we need to have a compensation and flexibility, meaning that there should be a fair distribution. That is why I'd like to request a rigorous study to establish a quota that is fair and that factors in biological security, social security, and security in terms of planning, but also fair distribution amongst member states. Because what is happening here is that we have an unfair distribution of the quota within Spain. Now, we know that the Council is currently meeting, and it is urgent that there be a rectification, and I'd like to call on the incoming Commissioner to really focus on this social aspect and the three areas of sustainability, because we hear what the fishers and the sector are saying to us. And this fleet, they have suffered much. They have been left without any quota. And we need to have a fair balance then amongst the three areas of sustainability. Thank you very much, Chair.
Lisa.
Madam de la Pisa, please.
Gracias.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised that the Commission and the Green Deal are turning their backs to our fishers. We will never give up, continuing to speak out against these decisions that you are making without scientific basis. You are putting at risk millions of lives in the various regions of Spain that live off the sea. Now I'm hearing the members call for social aspects to be factored in, and in addition to the environmental aspects. But we know that to date they have supported the environmental aspects that are leading us to this point. The quota for 2024 and 2025 are yet another sign of the policies that you are taking that will have a negative impact on our fishers. You would like them to have their vessels moored all the way up through till June. How will they provide for their families? How will they be able to maintain their livelihoods? We need to, of course, look at the anchovy population, but have you thought about the workers that live off this traditional sector? And we must, please, I'm begging you, let our fishers fish. They are the ones that are the most concerned with protecting our environment, and they provide us with affordable and healthy food, including sardines and anchovies, and they are also an enormous part of our culture. Thank you.
Si me permiten, como
Now, if you allow, I should like to put on my hat as a member of this parliament and not as the committee chair. And I would like to put some questions to Mr. Donatella. Now, the regional minister of Andalusia, in that role, I protected the Gulf of Candice. I have a certain amount of knowledge then, no more than you, sir, but without a doubt some. And I have to say that I was extremely surprised by this decision. First and foremost, because the Commission is making a decision at a point of transition, and this needs to be factored in. This is a drastic decision. And why do we need to look at this? We can see that there is a trend of the new Commission that will be incoming. They are going to, of course, yes, need to focus on the environmental aspects, but balance that with the economic and social aspects. The citizens of Europe made this decision that the focus needs to be on all three, and yet you are making a extremely clear decision that does not factor all of this in. So as members of the Commission, I think when you look at this drastic decision, it is not the time to take one that is so drastic at this point of time. Now, other speakers have made reference to the fact that there are 1,000 jobs, 75 vessels, and the entire Bay of Cadiz that is at risk. The economic impact to families and to the sector is extremely high, 75% of sales. Now, for a long time, we have seen that there is an approach where we look at the scientific data, of course, and we are waiting for the upcoming benchmarking exercise. Independent of that, you have not looked at the 20 meters from land to the sea, where you can see there is the highest concentration of the population, and therefore there is a mistake in the approach in the report, and the sector is drawing attention to this. They are making a demand, and they would like to have a different focus on the entire basis, and hope that you will factor in that. Now, the sector has also been affected by tax and quotas every single year. It's not the first time where we're having such a drastic approach. Mr. Mianmon and all of the members here have pointed to this. The social economic impact is not a question that the Commission is making. Rather, there is the court ruling that states that the measures to address this must be adopted. Therefore, we are calling on you to address this. Moreover, we would like to see a withdrawal of this proposal. There is a legal mistake with the proposal to not allow the swaps between the small fisheries of the various countries. So we have here a legal mistake that is at the basis of this proposal. So not looking at any sustainability in any single fishing area. Therefore, we are asking for clear explanations on the scientific data, the social economic impact, and we also qualify this proposal as absolutely unacceptable. because we recognize the repercussions that this decision would have. Now, in the Council, we know that there are a number of countries, Spain, Portugal. I think there are 14 member states that are along the same lines, that have the same beliefs and the same circumstances, and therefore we should like to call for the withdrawal of this proposal. Thank you.
Palabra al señor Donatella.
Mr. Donatella.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for the intervention and the questions that have been raised. And let me come back maybe on a couple of important elements. And first of all, because this has been mentioned several times, is the taking into account of the socioeconomic consideration for the proposal that the Commission has put forward. And I have to be very clear on this particular aspect. This is something on which we are very much in line with the CFP legal regime. It is an extremely important aspect, of course, of the way we manage fisheries. The simple fact that we are dealing with a stock that has been in decline since years, that from one year to another has suddenly received an advice of a reduction of minus 54%, which is quite significant on such an important stock and area, on also an advice that indicates that we need to take immediate drastic measures to avoid a collapse of the stock, which would affect the whole area. And here we're not just talking about one particular component, but the two components is quite alarming. And from the Commission point of view, we are looking at a stock that possibly could not be exploited anymore in the very near future unless actions are taken. So we do look at how such a fisheries management measure can impact on the activities. But again, I repeat, and I think it has to be a very clear point, the Commission is not in a position to make proposals that are not legally sound and that are not fitting exactly within the framework that we need to implement. Deviating from the MSY advice for this particular stock would not be legally allowed. We are looking at a different situation compared to the example that have been provided. We're looking at a situation that does not allow, according to the basic regulation or the multi-annual plan, to take into consideration additional factors to deviate from the MSY advice, hence the proposal of the Commission. And again, I have to say, unfortunately, with such a big decrease, we are perfectly aware that it is a measure that will have severe impact. And this is important because, from a Commission point of view, there was no other option here to follow the advice. You also ask about data. If my understanding is correct, is about part of the survey that has been produced in order for ICES to be in a position to issue the advice. This is a very important process, and I'm very happy that you have raised that, because one of the key issues in which the Commission is engaging since many years, and even more recently, is the interaction with national scientists that are being called by ICES to provide the advice. The Commission does not sit into scientific committee. The Commission does not interfere or intervene into any of scientific work that needs to be delivered by the scientific community. And the Commission does not anticipate results because that would be against the CFP rules. We do believe that building capacity, having the possibility for ICES, including the national scientists, to interact with the stakeholder, to answer those very important questions that you have raised, which is what is at the basis of an advice, is a process that needs to continue, and we know that ICES has put in place a series of measures to ensure that the interaction with the stakeholder allow also to discuss and to challenge sometimes science. But again, this is now that we have at the end of a very important process. We have an advice that has been validated by ICES and therefore that has been conducted, that has been endorsed also by those who are members of the executive committee of the organization. And we do believe that this is the best advice that we need to use in order to implement our proposal. I would like also to make a final remark because this has been really an important issue that has been raised during the whole debate that we have had since and even before the Commission issued the proposal to the Council, and which is the internal management of the fishery. This is very sensitive, this is very delicate, and I said it in my intervention. This is not a matter on which the Commission has any possibility to legally intervene, and we should not see that. However, it is also important that we have a continuous dialogue with the authorities in order to ensure that the fishery can be managed, including at regional or national level, in such a way that we can meet the obligations that are coming from this advice. So, to explain how the Commission came to the proposal was very important for us today. To be in a position also to clarify the ground on which we are working, including with those involved, is equally important. And here today, I was very happy that I was in a position to make that presentation. Of course, the discussion continues in the context of the Council, and we will see what will be the end result. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Señor Dress.
Mr. Dress, please.
Frau Vorsitzende.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This reminds us a little of the debate on the Baltic Sea fishery. The Iberian fishers are facing a downturn and unemployment, and the presentation, I think, is an attack on the fishery, on the Iberian Peninsula, on the many small companies, and ultimately on jobs. And to be perfectly frank, I'm a bit, and I'm grateful to the chairman for having summed it up so well, but I might be a little bit more familiar with the politics of the Baltic Sea, but listening to the Commission representative saying, we have no other choice. We're not doing politics. But you are doing politics if, as the Commission, you're involved in the legislative process, and people who have invested, want to guarantee their jobs in the Iberian Peninsula, find that they have no other choice. So I do think we need to strengthen the hand of those that are opposing this paper, rejecting it. It's not actually worth the paper it's written on because it doesn't take into account the conditions faced by small and medium-sized fishing communities. But I have a question now, actually. Europe is a big family. And, okay, there are national interests, that's all well and good, but what I haven't understood is how these swaps, these quota exchanges are supposed to be a problem. Countries had them, they swapped them, what's the problem? It seemed to me that you tried to sum up with a sentence saying, you know, you've got to prevent more fishing in the south. I mean, that was a bit of a half explanation. I'd really like to understand why these swaps between member states are supposed to be this big problem. Thank you.
Si antes de pasar la...
Before I go the floor to Mr. Donatella, and I'd like to, as a member here, reiterate what Mr. Drosse has just said. Before you close an entire fleet, you need to have then science, the scientific study first, do things correctly, and there's always time before you destroy an entire fleet. Look at that. There's always a chance, of course, to step it back, have the scientific study, and allow, in certain areas, the ability to look at this in depth before you destroy an entire fleet in the area. And Mr. Donatella, the floor is yours to reply.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just would like indeed to provide some clarification about what we call the swaps. And in this particular case, it's a pretty straightforward exercise because in the southern component, you have essentially one member state that is in a position to swap with Spain, which is Portugal. And of course, by swapping, which is basically exchanging fishing opportunities, and this is a mechanism that is entirely in the hands of the member states in which the Commission only receive a notification, so we have no decision to take, we have no follow-up, we have no monitoring, we're just receiving information in order to be able to monitor the implementation of the decision. The swaps can indeed increase the fishing effort on the component that is the most fragile. So the Commission considered that the swaps were not a problem in particular, but in this particular case, because we needed to maintain a protection for the southern component of the anchovy, we were proposing to ensure that in this case, the swap would not be come into effect. So again, I think that from the Commission point of view, we were looking at the possibility here to implement measures that allow to be fully in line with scientists what are telling us, which is a stock that is declining overall, an area that is particularly fragile, that is feeling an increasing pressure, and you have seen the figures that I've shown over the past few years, on average between 300 and 400% of additional pressure contained to the original decision. And we needed to put a proposal on the table that were allowing not just to limit the overall catch and so to fulfill the obligation to have an MSY advice, but also to limit the activities in an area where we know that there is a real clear sign of deterioration and of a stock collapse. I hope I've been clear. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Fabri.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donatella. This brings this item to a conclusion, and I'd like now to move on to the next item. This is the presentation of a study, and is the EU Oceans and Fisheries Policy, latest developments and future challenges. So the next point looks at the study that was commissioned by the Policy Department, given to two consortia, Poseidon Europe, based in Belfast, Ireland, and FNS, that is in Brest, France. The study provides an overview of the common fisheries policy and other EU policies in relation to fisheries, aquaculture, and the blue economy and international ocean governance. It looks at current and future challenges, and it looks at the strengths and weaknesses of EU policy, and it leads the authors to assess these challenges and make a range of specific policy recommendations. Now, we will have a presentation. We will look first at fisheries and aquaculture, and then we will look at the policy fields in the EU blue economy and international ocean governance. Now, each speaker will have 10 minutes to present their point of view. I'd like to begin with Mr. Graham McFadden, and who will cover the chapters on fisheries policy, and then Mr. Tim Huntington, who will look at aquaculture policy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Could I have the next slide, please? I will take you very, very quickly through the state of play with regards to current policy, because we're short of time, and focus a little bit more perhaps on some of the key challenges facing the fisheries sector that have relevance for policy in the future, talk a little bit about some opportunities and prospects, and then conclude with a few policy recommendations. If I could have the next slide, please. So, of course, the basic regulation of 2013 of the Common Fisheries Policy is the latest iteration of the CFP, which is typically evaluated and updated every 10 years or so, and is currently due for evaluation. In our report, we provide quite a lot of detail of the different sections in the policy that relate to fisheries. So importantly, first of all, on conservation and sustainable management. There's a lot of information in the policy itself and in our report about principles and approaches, about some of the key measures, such as multi-annual plans and TACs and so on. And just in terms of the current status of the impact of these policies, the percentage of the assessed stocks that are overexploited has decreased from 74% in 2004 down to 32% in 2022. But as we've heard today already, there are still a number of stocks that are facing significant challenges. The percentage of stocks outside safe biological limits has also declined from 80% in 2003 to 41% in 2023. Next slide, please. Management of fishing capacity is another key element of the CFP. Member States must balance capacity with fishing opportunities and report to the Commission on that, provide data for the fleet register, a searchable database, and comply with an entry-exit scheme. And as you can see, or you might be able to see from the figure, there's been very consistent declines in capacity, both in kilowatts and gross tons over the last 20 years or so. There are now around 54,000 active vessels in the EU fleet, 76% of which are small scale, and around 120,000 fishers. Next slide, please. Common fisheries policy provides the basis for scientific underpinning of fisheries management through the data collection framework, which generates a lot of the data that's important, studies and research, and also provides for key scientific bodies that we've been hearing a lot about today, ICES, JRC, the Joint Research Council, STECF, RFMOs, and the advisory councils all play an important role in contributing the scientific basis for fishery management. The CFP also provides for organisation of the markets, and producer organisations are key in this regard, particularly in terms of their production and marketing plans, and policy also covers common marketing standards, consumer information on products, and market intelligence provided by the EU Market Observatory. Imports account for around 70% of EU fish that is consumed in the EU, of a total consumption of around 10 million tonnes a year, and the EU exports around 2 million tonnes. Next slide, please. Control and enforcement, perhaps the two most important subsidiary or enabling legislation in terms of control and enforcement are the control regulation amended in 2023, particularly to allow for increased technology and digitalization in control, bringing more of the under 12 metre segment within the rules, and also to some extent bringing recreational fisheries within the control rules and framework. The IUU regulation is also important, and this relates to the famous yellow and red card, which allows the EU to prevent imports from countries that are non-complying. Key actors in terms of control and enforcement are member state competent authorities, the European Fisheries Control Agency, and of course the Commission. In terms of financial instruments, the most important enabling regulation relates to the European Maritime Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund, and the current legislation provides for 6.2 billion euros of funding over the period 2021 to 2027, covering the four topics of our presentation today and our report. Advisory councils also play a critical role in the CFP, and there are 11 of them, 7 with a geographical competence and 4 with a subject matter competence, such as the Market Advisory Council. And the advisory councils recommend and inform the Commission on issues and contribute to data collection. In terms of other policies, again, there's a lot of information in our report on these, so I won't go into any detail on them. I think the point to make here that's important is that many of these policies have targets which will help to drive change in the fisheries sector, and so have a particular relevance to the fisheries sector. And perhaps the action plan on an energy transition of EU fisheries is one that's particularly worth highlighting in terms of the implications on the fisheries sector for a green and energy transition, which will have big impacts on the sector in terms of costs of vessel and engine modernisation. Next slide, please. So moving on to some of the key challenges. Political challenges, there are many geopolitical challenges facing the sector. A lot of third countries are increasingly requiring sovereignty over their resources and wishing for their own fleets to catch fish in their waters. And Brexit has also been a contributory factor to some traditional resources being closed off to EU fleets. There has been some concern about the speed with which advisory councils have been proposing conservation measures, which was one of the key motivations and ideas behind their establishment. Of course, often we hear of quotas being set above the scientific advice because of some of the social and economic elements, again, we've been hearing about today. In terms of economics, I want to particularly highlight the market situation, which I think poses very particular challenges for the EU fisheries sector. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. There's questions over the level playing field with imports, uncertainty over how consumer preferences will impact on the market for EU fish. I'm thinking here of things like animal welfare, the carbon footprint of fisheries compared to other sources of protein, and even into the future, alternative plant-based sources of protein, which may threaten the demand for EU caught fish. Also, economically, costs of fishing are a significant challenge to fisheries, most notably, of course, the fuel costs, which for many fleets represent by far the largest single operational cost item. Many social challenges as well facing the sector. A lot of conflicts with other marine users in the marine coastal space, offshore wind farms, for example, some offshore aquaculture. And aging fisher demographics are something that we hear a lot about within the sector. Generally, the fisher population has been aging over time with not so many young people coming into the industry. And finally, on the social aspects, I think there's a big challenge in terms of the need and the ability and the speed with which the fisheries sector workforce can be upskilled and with which safety improvements can be put into place in the sector. Next slide, please. Other key challenges, technological. There's a big challenge, we think, for the fisheries sector to adapt to new technologies, to digitalization, to artificial intelligence. This provides both opportunities but also challenges in making this transition for the future. Much of the EU's fisheries infrastructure is aging, and there's also a challenge with respect to the need for using technology to aid with increased fishing selectivity. In terms of the legal environment, the large number of regulations and expanding regulations over time has resulted in a somewhat low trust by many fishers with the regulations and with the EU institutions, and this is a challenge, I think, to be addressed in the future. And of course, EU funding is not unlimited, and so there are limits to EU funding which pose challenges for the whole sector to make, particularly the green and technological transition that will be required for the future. Environmental challenges, again, perhaps one of the most important we've highlighted in red here on the screen is climate change mitigation and adaptation. Again, a lot of uncertainty about the future with respect to climate change. Fish stocks are already beginning to move and adapting, and also making sure that the fisheries sector plays its role in mitigating climate change is important. So let me just conclude then, as I'm running out of time, go straight to the policy recommendations. The report contains a SWOT analysis of some of these threats and challenges, but the policy recommendations flow from them. So first of all is to increase support for funding, particularly through innovative mechanisms, to help the fisheries sector transition to a green and digital transition. This is something that was highlighted by the European Economic and Social Committee, and there's potential to use other sources of funding, not just MFAF, to help with this transition. Secondly is to develop a fisheries-specific technology policy. And we think, given the importance of technology and digitalization for the future, an overarching fisheries policy on technology could be beneficial. Thirdly, relates to the development of market standards that ensure a level playing field in the production of seafood and other marine products imported into the EU. So this needs to be supported by market policy and rules to prevent unfair competition from non-EU imports to ensure a level playing field. Fourthly is to increase policy support for the fisheries sector labour force. Policy needs to be better and perhaps specifically address ways to ensure recruitment of new labour into the sector to replace an ageing workforce, to upskill fisheries labour, and where appropriate, help with transition out of the fisheries sector into other employment opportunities. Fifthly is to tighten policy content and implementation mechanisms to better support environmental regulations, and there are three aspects here. One is to better ensure that annual quotas can be legitimately set above scientific advice based on economic and social concerns, but not for political compromise. Secondly is to ensure that regionalised conservation measures through advisory councils, which have been slow to be adopted, speed up in the future. And thirdly, across many policy provisions and requirements, for example, fisheries control, the speed and quality of implementation between member states is very variable. And then finally, our sixth recommendation relating to fisheries is to rebuild trust between sector stakeholders and EU institutions through a review of policy development, implementation and evaluation processes. And with that, I will conclude this short presentation. Thank you, Chair.
Muchas gracias, señor McFadden.
Thank you very much, Mr. McFadden. I do hope your colleagues will be a little briefer. I'll give the floor straight away to Mr. Huntington to look at the aquaculture policy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to be looking at how the CFP guides sustainable aquaculture development in the EU, that is the farming of finfish, shellfish and seaweeds. Next slide, please. So, following my colleague's approach, I'll be focusing mostly on the challenges and how the policies address those challenges and how we can really look at the opportunities and prospects for better policy. So, looking at the state of play, the EU as a bloc is the 10th largest aquaculture producer in the world. It's seen an increase of about 11% of volume, but a 34% increase in value since 2012. But it does only farm a relatively few number of species, given that various different species of mussels account for nearly 40% of European production and trout 15%. It is also focused in a number of different member states, particularly in Spain, France, Greece and Italy. But EU aquaculture is only actually a very small part of global production, only about 1.15%, and provides only about 10% of EU seafood. Next slide. In terms of how policy works, Article 34 of the CFP is specific to agriculture, really focusing on being competitive, innovative, and integrated into the maritime spatial planning. Compared to to capture fisheries, the management of aquaculture in the EU is a shared competence with EU member states. So there's much more down to the member states to dictate what is required. And that's managed through a particular method called an open method of coordination, and includes various different methodologies. Firstly, and the key, is the non-binding strategic guidelines, which were originally produced in 2013 and have now been replaced in 2021 for the next 10 years. Part of that is that member states need to develop multi-annual national strategic plans, and they will undergo a midterm evaluation next year. And since 2021, the EU Aquaculture Assistance Mechanism has been in place. The other part where aquaculture is really at a large level of policy detail is in the European Green Deal. So things like contribution to net zero, such as the promoting IMTA in low-trophic aquaculture, move to a circular economy, ecosystem approach, and highly skilled and inclusive careers. Looking at the challenges, there are multiple challenges, but probably four key ones. Firstly is adapting EU aquaculture to and mitigating its contribution to climate change. Secondly is maintaining the competitiveness of EU aquaculture in the face of high costs of inputs and meeting regulatory requirements. To demonstrate that, the direct energy used by the sea bass farming, actually use only increased by 0.7% over 2 years, but costs increased by 70%, which shows how important, how much costs have gone up. Third is coexistence with other marine activities and the growing competition for marine space. And finally is obtaining the social license for establishing and operating aquaculture in the EU's sea and landscapes. Looking at analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the various different policy areas I've discussed, Probably the main strengths are in blue economy, which focuses on promoting coexistence and the building of synergies across different aquaculture with other different maritime economic activities, and areas of technical innovation, such as under ETIP and Horizon Europe. But there are weaknesses as well. Primarily, EU legislation can be complex and sometimes not easily understood, and there are still considered administrative burdens and complexities. The European Court of Auditors shared an analysis of in 6 case study countries and showed that there haven't been any long-term improvements in this, despite this being a major focus of the OMC. Next slide. So in terms of the opportunities, challenges and prospects, strengths of the current policy is a strong environmental focus. It's not overly prescriptive, mainly through the OMC approach, and there's good common understanding and coherence across the European Union. In terms of weaknesses, maybe policy at the moment doesn't sufficiently encourage growth. The multi-annual national plans could be better linked to MFAF operational programmes, the MFAF funding, and there could be better integration into maritime spatial planning. And as we transfer into low-carbon aquaculture, there may be a loss of competitiveness of the short term, because this will be an expensive exercise. And like capture fisheries, the sector needs to be made more attractive to younger people. There are opportunities as well. Increased growth via simplified administration, better co-location with offshore energy and greater linkages to local blue economy, providing an improved social licence to operate, and a large area of interest now is world-leading welfare standards and practices. In terms of threats, which I've alluded to in terms of competition for sea space, insufficient quality and quantity of water, particularly in freshwater aquaculture, and the loss of social licence due to increasing environmental and welfare concerns from consumers and also consumer dietary trends. So we have 3 recommendations for aquaculture. Firstly is policy recommendation 7 is increased emphasis on growing and diversifying EU aquaculture to meet the EU food security and environmental objectives. So that could be things such as developing new species, particularly a move towards low trophic aquaculture, and there's a rapid expansion of things like seaweed farming, encouraging the consumption of farmed seafood, which has always been at a negative to capture fisheries, and has been the focus for many years, easing the administrative burden of licensing of aquaculture. The second recommendation we have for aquaculture is to consider a long-term strategic realignment to adapt to and benefit from the expected consequences of climate change. Climate change is already having a profound impact on aquaculture worldwide, but with an alignment, particularly geographic alignment, moving production, adapting to production to different areas as circumstances change, we can actually benefit from higher temperatures in certain areas. So it just needs a certain degree of realignment over time. And finally, develop the coexistence between aquaculture, local communities and other maritime economic activities. Really, this is to focus on building the social licence to operate. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Huntington.
Thank you, Mr. Huntington. And now I would just like to ask if the head of unit of DG Mare would like to comment at this stage.
Thank you very much, Chair. I can do it later at the end, I think. Thank you.
Sí, pasamos, si les parece, a...
So then we can move on to hear comments from members. Mr. Rodriguez has asked for the floor first. Oh dear.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to thank you very much for the presentations of these studies and welcome the conclusions that are very broad and very well targeted. They look at blue economy, fisheries, and international management of oceans. But they really do look decisively at the challenges that the EU faces in all of these areas and how important EU policy decisions and national policy decisions will be. The policy recommendations should focus more at protecting fishers, biodiversity, and also making sure that we have fair pay for our fishers as well as for our fishing communities. The conclusions on this point are very clear on the challenges: climate change, market uncertainty, not enough technology in the sector, and on the needs, of course, to give more potential to innovation and integrating technology more in our fisheries and making sure that we are meeting our environmental objectives. So this study is a good point of departure for analysis, but it should have more ambition and it should bring into the mix more stakeholders. For example, when it comes to modernizing the fleet, and support to green and digital transitions in the sector, as well as training and of all of those involved. In the policy recommendations, therefore, offer us a lot of opportunities to continue to work here in this committee. In addition to that, it also allows all stakeholders and member states to be able to cooperate more on these aspects. I'd like to welcome the partnerships, international partnerships, to make sure that there is no IUU that has a negative impact on the EU and outside of the EU as well. Thank you very much.
Señor Millán Mon.
Mr. Millán Mon.
Perdón. Decía que gracias, presidente.
Sorry, I was just saying a thank you to the chair and thank you to the research service of the Parliament and the people presenting this report, which is very comprehensive and wide-ranging. It covers a lot of things. I'd like to begin by saying that this study, which has to be read with care, shows that the current CFP is not up to all of the political and economic and social, technological, legal and environmental challenges that are out there that face the fisheries sector. The administrative burden of the CFP is still high. We recently saw a graph showing the number of vessels. The number has constantly decreased over the years. The number of vessels at kilowatt hours, people employed in the sector, and so on and so forth, fishing capacity. And on top of that, there's this external dimension of our fisheries policy that you referred to in your presentations, the defence of the fleet and defence of European standards. Well, that's not been very successful. This is a point I often stress. The overly environmentalist approach that we take in the current CFP, I think, is its weak point. And in this context, I would like to ask you, do you think that this the Commission's assessment of the CFP is sufficient, or should there be a more thorough reform of the CFP? You've mentioned important challenges like, the generation renewal and decarbonisation. I think this is a problem linked to fishing capacity, but there's also a technological challenge. What would be the fuel of the future? And then economic deficits, the economic challenge. How is this transition, modernisation of engines, how is that to be paid for? You call for more coherence between the implementation of CFP and environmental legislation. I think that environmental objectives are very important and very respectable, but they shouldn't prevail over other important aims of the CFP, which are the economic and social objectives. I think a balance has to be struck, and that indeed has been upheld by the Court of Justice this January. So I think that's what the CFP should do, strike the right balance between protection and production. And this is why we need the best possible biological advice, but we also need the right economic and social advice. And now, if you don't mind, Madam Chair, I'd like to quickly mention aquaculture. This sector needs to become more competitive. We need a level playing field. We need to promote agricultural production, aquaculture production, sorry. Member states must realise that the sector faces all sorts of administrative hurdles to overcome. So there's a risk of stagnation, and also there's the question of the competition from third country products that don't respect the same standards. So aquaculture and the fish canning and seafood canning sector, processing sector, should be taken into account when we are, negotiating agreements with other countries. I'll leave it at that.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the gentleman for this presentation. It was extremely interesting. I would like to stress that when I talk about Dutch fishers who work on a daily basis to try to improve the situation at sea and on board and develop all sorts of new techniques and technologies in order to be prepared for the future, I'm very impressed by everything that they're doing. And I heard from the first presentation that new technology is more than welcome in fisheries. I would like to ask, what are you looking at when you talk about new technology for fisheries? What is your point of departure to re-equip fishing vessels, to introduce further innovation? I'm asking specifically about this because, as you know, Dutch fishers are very innovative in their methods, and they've actually faced obstacles in their innovation. So it's very interesting for us to know, what are you specifically looking at when you talk about innovation and new technology that needs to be developed for fisheries? Thank you.
Señor Ruijsen.
Mr. Ruijsen.
Voorzitter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also thank you for these very clear studies, which are very comprehensive and cover all the important aspects affecting the fisheries policy. There's one important aspect that I want to focus on, which is the energy transition. What do we need to do this well? I think one thing we need to begin with is a good and robust discussion about fishing methods and techniques. My question is, what existing methods, fishing methods, have you encountered in your research that could contribute to the energy transition and which at the same time can enhance selectivity and ensure less contact with the seabed? Can I say that in Scotland at the moment, experiments are being conducted with electric pulse fishing for bivalve mollusks. This research is expected to continue until 2025. So I think it's useful to look at research of this kind. I'd like to know what you think about this and whether the Commission is also prepared to take on board the results of such research in order to create space for the introduction of new fisheries techniques in Europe. So I think a discussion on that is important. Secondly, money. The researchers rightly point out the need for investment in the energy transition. That's going to require funding, and unfortunately the CFP's budget is perhaps not sufficient for this. So the other question that comes up is, where is the money going to come from for the necessary investments? And the third aspect, which I think requires some adjustment to the rules, and I would like to ask the researchers what they think of this, is what changes are necessary in the definition of fishing capacity. I think the definition of catch capacity is extremely important. Has important socio-economic repercussions. So I'd like to know the opinion of the researchers and the Commission on that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this evaluation. Very timely also in the start of the mandate to have an overview like this. And I mean, it also really shows the major challenges that we stand against as policymakers to better improve the state of our oceans and our fishing sector. But in regard to the policy recommendations, I clearly see a pattern is what being recommended. Several occasions the report mentioned the increase of economic support, and especially then direct support for green transition, digital transition, so on, within the common fishery policy, but also outside of that. And I know it's not very popular at this stage to be very frugal and careful with the spending, especially of the EU budget. But I also think it's a risky approach to always count on budget support and public money to support the sector. I would rather see a more market-based approach where also the fishermen can stand and be economically viable themselves, and that we need to improve the system so that they are financially stable even without direct income support. So I want to ask you about that in this regard. How can we ensure that the operators of the blue economy are economically viable long-term without those investments? And if there are any specific policy advice that are not financial support that you would like to highlight or mention? You have several here, but is there something you see as most critical elements to have a financial viable situation for the fishermen across the EU? That would be very much appreciated. So thank you so much for this study, and I think we have a lot to continue the work on.
Señora Levin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I hear many members are concerned about the economic viability of the fishing sector, and of course that is very important, but I think we all can agree that without any fish, there can't be any prosperous fishing sector. So I am very concerned that when you look at the status of the stocks that are, the percentage of stocks outside safe biological limits, we still have 41% of the stocks that are outside of safe biological limits. And when we reformed the common fisheries policy in 2013, the year that we saw that we should have finished the job by rebuilding all the stocks would be 2020. Now we're at 2024, and we're still not there. And I think this should be the core question of this report. Why haven't we achieved safe biological limits for all the commercially exploited fish stocks by now? So that's my question to the authors. What is the main reason why we're not there yet? We have had more than 10 years of rebuilding the stocks, and we're still not there. So that's one question. On aquaculture, I also have a question about one of the main kind of the core, the core principle of any aquaculture is that you have feed for the species. And globally, we have a lot of fisheries going to feed for carnivore aquaculture species, such as salmon, for instance, in Norway, and a lot of the fisheries that we were discussing earlier on herring and sprat in the Baltic Sea. All of that goes, basically almost all of it goes to feed salmon aquaculture in Norway. So it's not for human consumption. So that is also a major question. Why you don't address this main problem in this report, and how you see that we can actually increase aquaculture without also increasing the industrial fishing for feed in Europe and elsewhere, importing it to Europe to feed aquaculture fish and other marine creatures. Thank you.
Señor Flanagan.
Mr Flanagan.
Thank you very much, and a very important report, well, for people who are new to participating in this committee and for the start of a new term, because it gives you a good overview of what's going on. And what stuck out for me on the report, and I have questions for Graham, is in relation to innovative funding mechanisms and also this thing whereby small-scale fishers are slow or reluctant to take up new technologies. So what I'd like to know is, are there any other examples of innovative funding mechanisms, in particular for small-scale operators who want to engage with new technology but who are unable to access the funding under MFAF due to the way it's administered by the relevant member state? And I'll give you an example. Where I am from in Ireland, I work with small-scale fishers who operate from small islands. They have had several technological avenues that they want to explore, but funding difficulties mean they can't move forward. So I hear this thing about how they're reluctant to move with technology, but the people I'm dealing with directly would love to move forward with technology, but the funding isn't allowing for it. And I'll give you an example. Abelobi, a pilot funded by Rethink Ireland, included in IMRO's PO production and marketing plan, but cannot access the funding. And one other example, when it comes to automatic identification system, IMRO submitted a proposal to the Irish Minister and Department in May 2023 for the supply of AIS equipment under MFAF. And I'm saying this in the context of small-scale fishers not wanting to take up technological opportunities. But in this case, when they tried to do it, they didn't even get a reply from our government. So while I hear a lot of good things here, and I do hear a lot of good things, and when I hear the Commission speak, it looks like potentially a good future. But when you look at it at close level, at national level, and you look for advances on fundings, not so people can support themselves forever, so they can lift them up and get them off the ground, it's not happening. So when it comes to innovative funding mechanisms, can you elaborate on that, please? Thank you.
Señor Nascimento Cabral.
Mr. Nascimento Cabral.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for the studies. And there are some fundamental points that have been brought forth here in the reports. For example, 70% of the fish that we consume is imported. And for this, in agri, but also in fisheries, we need to have the same rules for all, so for those products that come to the EU, so that with third countries, we can make sure that we have the best possible products in the EU. Now, on the economic aspect of the sector, many fishers have stated that they do not have enough income to rise to the challenges that they currently face when they are, for example, professional equipment concerns, but it's also difficult to attract young fishers to the sector. And therefore, we have seen that there have been difficulties also with the implementation of the conservation measures that have a huge impact on fisheries in the EU, a big pressure on our fishers when they have to implement quotas and targets that are extremely radical. Let us call them radical. Now, that means that that can have a huge impact on the EMFA funds and the transition when it comes to the digital transition and the renewal of the fleets. So I'd like to conclude with a concern. The Draghi report speaks about the blue economy. But when we look at our economy and the Atlantic Ocean as a reference for the EU and the potential that we have with the Atlantic Ocean and the blue economy. Now, this report looks at the future of fishing opportunities and fishing policy. We need to have this Atlantic aspect, the bioeconomy and the blue economy as a fundamental point for the competitiveness of the European Union's economy in the world. Thank you. Mr. Bajada, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think everything is linked together, and of course I wanted to do also an intervention at the very end with respect to international ocean governance. So maybe this is also where I will put some questions also for the presenters. We'll always remain worried that we still assess everything as if everything is together, putting small-scale fisheries with industrial fisheries, putting artisanal fisheries in the same basket as if we are talking about the large-scale fisheries, assessing all seas and all member states as if they are all the same. And that is why I subscribe to any comments that are being done with respect to the importance of seeing and the importance of discussing how we can help our small-scale fishers to progress, for our small-scale fishers to access funding. Because at the end of the day, improvement of working conditions and safety, the green and energy transition, adaptation, and finally intergenerational challenges depend on access to funding. Because our small-scale fisheries require funding. It is not an issue of marketing. It is not an issue of market when we are looking at old-age vessels of small-scale fishermen that depend on massive investment to reach our digital and green energy goals. And that is why the access to funding is right now a discussion that we need to have because of the limited issues that we have, the limited access that we have for onboard investments due to national capacity limits and state aid regulations. And these are two important things that we must see to help our small-scale fishers. And secondly, I may be biased because of my academic sector, but international ocean governance for me is key in fisheries. Because the EU must use all its leverages to ensure that other third countries progress towards sustainable fisheries. Yet this is not always possible. We must therefore ensure that the EU promotes its ambitious regulations to RFMOs in order for their take-up internationally. Because furthermore, it is essential that compliance by third countries are taken on board by RFMOs, so that third countries and us, we ensure that there is a level playing field between our small-scale fishers and the small-scale fishers of third countries. And that is where the EU must be stronger armed with third countries. And this is where the EU should enshrine social justice and defend our fishers at the face of third country fishers who do not follow international rules, and at the face of imported products that do not adhere to our same standards. So my question is, of course, also to the next speakers, where they will be talking about international ocean governance. How can we see that we can adapt our own regulations on an international level and see that there is enough capacity of RFMOs and enough capacity of third countries in order to ensure that they stay up to our same standards? Because at the end of the day, it is our small-scale fishers that depend on the sector, and it's our small-scale fishers that we need to invest in, especially in these transitions that we need to do to ensure that the fisheries is sustainable in the future. Thank you.
Señora Miranda.
Ms. Miranda.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to the authors of the studies that carried out intensive work in compiling all of these policy recommendations and an analysis also of the fishing sector here in the EU. I'm from the Atlantic, and like Mr. Nascimento, I should like to defend this Atlantic aspect. It means that a fisher in Galicia is earning less than 10 years ago, and a shellfish fisherman in Galicia has lost his job over the course of recent months, frequently for things that do not have anything to do with fishing because of contamination, black tides, for environmental conditions. Now, had there been public aid, frequently there is not assistance that is offered. That means that they are not able to eat, and many find themselves in extremely serious circumstances. Therefore, I'd like to put two questions. The social aspect, this very important social aspect that is addressed in the report, demographics, for example, and the challenges of generational renewal, and also recruiting people and having public funds when you have very serious situations and there is no other alternative. Yes, it's important to have economic diversification, as you state, but when you look at the coastal communities like ours in Galicia and in Portugal, we do not have any other alternative, and that's another aspect. In the European Parliament, unfortunately, we've seen an uptick in hate speech. And I think that in this Fisheries Committee, we need to be extremely clear. We should thank our foreign workers because frequently, thanks to them, the European fisheries sector can continue to function. Now, over the course of the last 5 years, we've had workers from Morocco, Senegal, and Peru, and from many other countries. So I'd like to thank them at this time, specifically when there's an increase in hate speech. We should not allow that to take place here in this committee. It hasn't in the past, and I hope it will not, but I'd like to sound the warning now. Moreover, coexistence with aquaculture. You spoke about the bureaucratic limits when it comes to aquaculture. The issue really is that frequently there is analysis based on economic factors that do not look at the social factors of aquaculture. So we need to look in certain European fisheries, for example, in Portugal and Croatia and also in Galicia, where there's an extensive aquaculture reality. Sometimes there are huge plants, and we know that frequently they are not sustainable and that they do not actually take on board the three aspects of sustainability that we mentioned before. Thank you very much. Now, perhaps our two experts would like to reply to the queries put by the members. Mr. Feiden, go ahead, please.
Por favor.
Very briefly, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the interesting observations and comments. I'll just try to respond to a couple of them. There were several comments related to the extent to which the CFP is currently doing the job that it should be doing, particularly in terms of why are some stocks not being sustainably managed now. I think that's probably maybe for the Commission to share some information about the planned evaluation of the CFP to give us a little bit more information about that. There was a second group of questions related to funding mechanisms. I think that provides some sort of validation for our first recommendation. We're not certainly suggesting that there should be long-term and indefinite direct support, but what is important is that there is funding to help with the transition. It wasn't within the scope of our study to look and provide very specific, concrete details about all sorts of different innovative funding mechanisms that could be available, but the European Economic Social Committee has made some proposals in terms of accessing additional sources of funding from the European Investment Bank, customs duties on carbon border adjustment, and mobilising resources linked to energy taxation. But that's, again, something that potentially warrants more research to really understand additional sources of funding that can be put into place that are innovative, because, of course, funds like the MFAF are not going to be bottomless. But the idea behind the importance of funding is to make the transition, to help with the transition so that the fisheries sector can contribute and adapt to climate change in particular, and digitalisation and the need for technology. Maybe just a final comment on technology. Dutch fishers, of course, are well known for their innovation, but I think the requirement for a technology policy is valid and relevant given the challenges of introducing technology in many fleets and many member states. And the sorts of things here that we were thinking of, and you asked for specific examples, are some of the technologies that can help with control of fisheries, with automation on board, with providing high-level data that can contribute an input into science, and also technologies that may help with selectivity of fishing gear. So I think with that, maybe I can pass to Tim, can comment a few on some of the aquaculture-related suggestions.
Yes, thank you, Graham. Yes, I'll just address a few of the comments which were made to this. So again, very interesting. One, I think, and it's a sort of theme that's come across quite regularly today, is the purely environmental approach to management, which was criticised. Whilst, and I totally understand that and agree that sort of social and economic aspects need to be integrated into that as well. But particularly with aquaculture, good aquaculture thrives on good environmental conditions. So it has always been a really important part of aquaculture management, is to not pollute the water you're trying to grow your fish in or whatever. So that's one of the reasons why environment has been so heavily emphasised. It's also mentioned about the energy transition, and I think one of the main elements of the process will be recognising that feeds and aquafeeds, production of aquafeeds is probably 70% of the carbon footprint of, let's say, farmed salmon. So I think there's going to be a move away more towards unfed aquaculture, like low trophic aquaculture and low trophic species. Related again to feeds, I mean, there will still be a demand for the carnivorous species which were mentioned, such as salmon, sea bass, but there's been about a reduction by half of marine ingredients in salmon feeds, down from 13% to around about 5% now. And there's a huge amount of research going into things like novel ingredients such as plant-based materials and insect-based materials to try and reduce its dependence upon marine ingredients. There's one comment about trying to, focusing on trying to make money go further. I think the operational programs for things like MFAF, is really important that operational programs really understand what the priorities for aquaculture development are, and that funding through MFAF is focused on those priority areas. And that allows, and therefore, when you develop these multi-annual programs, they need to be really stakeholder-based and participatory in order to ensure that industry, and including the small-scale nature of aquaculture, is reflected in that funding priorities. Just finally, there's a comment about there's environmental conditions affecting aquaculture, I think particularly red tides and things like that, affecting shellfish farming. As we mentioned in the presentation, these are often being driven by climate change, and it's really important that aquaculture slowly adapts to these changing conditions. And that means, let's say, whether you're sort of a mussel farmer in Galicia, we need to help people adapt to that, maybe move to deeper waters or do different techniques to allow them to thrive and to increase their robustness and resilience to climate change. I think I've addressed most of the comments that came to aquaculture. Thank you.
Ahora sí, el señor...
Mr. Lindemann from DJ Mare, would you like to take the floor to address this presentation?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for this report with very clear findings and recommendations, which uses the best available and most recent scientific advice, reports and articles. The topics and the policy recommendations are very important for a resilient, innovative and sustainable fisheries and aquaculture future in the EU and internationally. You know that last year the Commission adopted a fisheries policy package of measures to improve the sustainability and resilience of the EU's fisheries and aquaculture sector, with renewed ambition notably on the energy transition and through the Energy Transition Initiative. Now, with the new Commission in place, we will have a Commissioner designate for ocean and fisheries, tasked to ensure that the sector remains sustainable, competitive and resilient, and to uphold a level playing field for the European fisheries value chain. These elements have been included in the mission letter to the Commissioner, which was handed to him last week. This focus on fisheries and ocean by the new Commission comes as a recognition of the importance of the sector and the role that it has to play in the years to come. Here we must not forget the broader food security context as well, and the need to ensure the social and economic sustainability of the sector and of coastal communities. This goes along with the conservation and restoration of biodiversity, whilst adapting and mitigating climate change and adjusting to the changing global geopolitical context. There has been the decision has been taken to undertake an evaluation of the CFP regulation, and that came as a follow-up to the Fisheries and Ocean package of February 2023 and the further discussions that have been held. And in particular, those were the discussions with and the recommendations from the European Parliament, from the Fisheries Committee, from the Fisheries Council in the Council, and through the reports and the presidency conclusions, because both of those called for an evaluation of the policy since its last reform in 2013. Now, with the evaluation which we have now launched as a basis, only the next Commission will be competent to take an appropriate decision for a possible future revision. And this full evaluation will provide our new Commissioner and the new College as a good basis to take informed decisions on how best to continue implementing the policy and, if and where necessary, to propose adjustments in the years ahead to meet the challenges, including the challenges of the energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move on now to the second section of the presentation of the study. This will be divided between Mr. Rod Capel, who's dealing with the EU Blue Economy Policy, and Mr. Benoit Caillard, who will speak on international ocean governance. First of all, I should like to call on Mr. Capel to share with us his insights on the EU Blue Economy, and he has a maximum of 10 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So let's start off with saying what we mean by the blue economy. So the Commission defines it as all economic activities related to oceans, seas and coasts, and it covers a wide range of interlinked, established and emerging economic sectors. The blue economy also includes those parts of the public sector which direct coastal and ocean responsibilities like national defence, the Coast Guard, marine environmental protection, as well as marine education and research. But what it isn't is an economic value for the ocean, which is difficult to quantify, but would be many, many times greater due to the ecosystem services that the ocean provides, a habitat for marine life, carbon sequestration, coastal protection and waste recycling. So it's certainly not that. It's very specifically focused on the economic sectors that are able to be defined. And I'll jump straight in. So next slide, please. So in terms of the state of play for the EU blue economy, the Blue Economy report that's produced each year is able to quantify a number of criteria for the established sectors, which you can see in the graph there. And these represent around 1.5% of the EU's total gross value added and about 2% of total EU employment. But this is an underestimate of the total blue economy because these are the sectors that Eurostat and other data sources can provide robust data on. There are many emerging sectors that aren't included here. So the true value of the blue economy is considered to be far greater than that. Nevertheless, it employed close to 3.6 million people with 624 billion in turnover in 2021. And 2021, you can see from that graph, showed the recovery from the COVID pandemic that was experienced in 2020. Coastal tourism was most impacted of all the sectors due to COVID, with a 64% decrease in GVA and a 48% decrease in employment in 2020. Marine renewable energy is the fastest growing sector and probably one of the fastest growing in the EU economy as a whole. The turnover of this sector grew from 91 million in 2009 to over 3.4 billion in 2021. It's a rapidly growing sector. The blue economy sector, marine living resources, kind of groups together fisheries and aquaculture as well as seafood processing and distribution. And these accounted for 15% of blue economy employment and 13% of the GVA. But despite steady growth in relation to these criteria, marine living resources shows the lowest average gross wages, along with the coastal tourism sector, of all the blue economy sectors. So it's incredibly significant socioeconomically, but the wage levels aren't as great as in other maritime sectors. Next slide, please. So in terms of the current policies, the integrated maritime policy was introduced in 2007, and this, because some aspects of the blue economy, the competences are shared with member states, or the EU plays a supporting role to member states. The IMP focused on research and innovation, knowledge sharing and guidance. More recently, a new approach that was published in 2021 trying to make sure that the IMP was coherent with the European Green Deal and the recovery plan for Europe. And it places the emphasis on the green and digital transitions through shared knowledge, investment in innovation, and new skills to help tackle climate change across the blue economy sectors. Next slide, please. So moving on to the key challenges that we've identified. So in the report, we list a large number of challenges across the blue economy sectors. There's three that I'd like to mention specifically and highlight here. One that we've heard briefly about previously is marine space. There are competing interests in EU waters for marine space, including the major growth of renewable energy that's underway and is planned. So the second challenge is ensuring this fair green and digital transition, especially for the traditional maritime sectors. There's a big focus on innovation and the innovators, but it makes it very difficult for traditional maritime sectors to make that transition. And thirdly, global competitiveness is a major issue for EU blue economy operators. They are faced with having to achieve very high environmental and social standards, while some of the non-EU suppliers into the EU market are not faced with the same level of standards. And there is, of course, in the seafood sector, a major reliance on imports. So ensuring that level playing field that we've heard about is essential. So how well do EU policies currently deal with some of these challenges? And again, three areas of weakness I'll highlight just there. Basically, even though a new approach was brought out in 2021, the geopolitical landscape has changed significantly even since then, due to Brexit, the war in Ukraine and tensions with China. So there's a real need to review where we stand in relation to policies and politics. Technology, we've mentioned. There's the focus on innovations and the innovators. There's been less of a focus on enabling existing operators to make that transition, and that should change. And legally, EU policy on marine spatial planning, which is so important, is actually quite limited to providing guidance to member states because they're responsible for the planning in their own waters. But policy that incentivizes coexistence and co-location to maximize the use of marine space is lacking. Next slide, please. Thank you. So moving on to the opportunities and prospects that we might highlight, and I'll just mention a couple here due to time. In terms of weaknesses, this transition support has been very high level to date. It's inaccessible to small-scale operators in many circumstances, as we've heard from some of the interventions discussed. Funding has targeted the tech providers, not the actual tech users, the blue economy operators so much. So that's where things could improve. And in terms of threats, I mentioned the lack of marine space and this prioritization of renewable energy. And that creates a real threat of displacement for existing users of that marine space. So to give a little example of that situation, it's notable that the offshore renewable capacity targets for 2030 set by member states, they actually add up to nearly double the target that's set by the Commission in the Offshore Renewable Energy Directive. So individually, member states are actually allocating more of their marine space to offshore renewable energy, which is understandable, but it's facing a squeeze on other sectors as a result. So moving on to the policy recommendations, The three that are highlighted in relation to the blue economy are providing support to blue economy operators in adapting to climate change and making this green and digital transition, incentivizing this co-location of activities in marine developments to maximize the use of marine space, and finally, defining other effective area-based conservation measures, OECMs, and developing a framework for their implementation. And this can then supplement the EU's MPA network, which under the biodiversity strategy has committed to a major expansion. And while necessary, yet again creates further squeeze on the marine space. So we need to look at innovative ways to identify where other areas are providing a conservation benefit. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Benoit.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Capel. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Kayan. He will be speaking to us about international ocean governance.
Je vais m'exprimer en français.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be speaking French. The presentation is going to focus on the international governance agenda. Next slide, please. And we'll follow the same format as for the other presentations by setting out the scene, looking at the challenges, and looking then at the opportunities and recommendations. Next slide, please. So the incentive here is to improve things across the board for all of those contexts which govern regional international legislation to ensure that things are managed in a sustainable way. So this is a global effort across all oceans. It started back in 2011 with the communication on the external dimension of the CFP came about, and that then allowed us to be sure that the standards would apply to vessels fishing in our external waters. And so that's the external dimension of the CFP as it stands at the moment. Then we got the UN 2022 Ocean Governance Agenda, and this was all part of this was a joint communication. We also, back in 2016, had the joint communication on international ocean governance, which was an agenda for the future of our oceans. So we were hoping to fight climate change, promote biodiversity, and look at geopolitical challenges that were coming to light. Next slide, please. Now, what about the tools? What can the EU do? Well, first of all, we've got the internal tools, as I would call them. These are the ones that are provided by the different regulations in force. So the fisheries agreements, for example, signed with 14 third countries as things stand at the moment. Then we've got the RFMOs, the regional fishery management organizations that allow these bodies to defend their interests. And everything that the CFP has for joint management of stocks that are held in common. So, for example, our Norwegian and British colleagues. Then we've got the external fishing regulation. We've also got one that promotes cooperation with third countries, notably the yellow and red card system, and the whole program that was implemented under DG Impact to look at strengthening capacity and governance. Now, the second aspect to all of this is the work that's gone on to support the EU with ratification and implementation of the international instruments that currently are in force. These would include, for example, the Law of the Sea, the New York Agreement, the ILO Convention on Port Control, and the Arctic as well, signed in 2022. Then there are instruments that relate to biodiversity. These are ones that can also be used for fisheries
to support stock fishery management, and they would include instruments to do with migratory stocks. We've also got a number of instruments that cover the social side of things, such as, for example, the International Labour Organization Convention on Work in Fishing. This is Convention C188, and the International Maritime Organization Convention on Training Standards for Fishers. This is the so-called STCWF. Then we've got the work that's still to be done. That's to say, the work that involves closing the gaps. That would involve having new instruments that would be brought to bear, trying to plug the holes. We've got the UN Treaty on the BBNJ. At the moment, that's been implemented but has to be ratified. The same would apply to the IMO agreement on fisheries subsidies, the WTO agreement on fisheries subsidies, and also the IMO agreement on safety standards for fishing vessels, and potentially also new RFMOs. Next slide, please. What are the key challenges? The ones that have been identified in our study reveal that there is a certain amount of pushback or resistance by members of the international community when it comes to abiding by international standards that support governance. We see that not everybody has the same ambition or has the same agenda when it comes to international instruments. So we are aware of compliance shortcomings when it comes to the adherence to certain instruments, and it's difficult then to get some agreements upheld, such as the one on fishing subsidies or the WTO. The second problem is just a lack of capacity in developing countries, non-EU countries, so that they would be able to ratify or implement international instruments supporting ocean governance. This is particularly the case of the least developed countries, who may be able to ratify the agreement, but when it comes to having the capacity to implement them, that is another matter. Thirdly, then, we are witness to a slight shift in the ability of the EU to exert influence. As a flag state, its influence is declining because the number of boats in the external fleet is declining, and the EU is finding itself a little marginalized in parts of the Indian area or the Pacific, and we are thereby at the same time seeing the influence of the EU increase in its action on markets. Next slide, please. And the next one after that will just speed up. So jump a slide. And one more. I'll move on now, given that there's not much time left, to policy recommendations. These are the recommendations that would be addressed to the EU. And first of all, we need to see support given to the entry into force of international treaties that have been adopted but have not yet entered into force, the UN BBNJ and on fisheries agreements, and then we need to push the ratification forward for some of the existing instruments. These are instruments that have been adopted but are yet to be ratified. The Sea Convention 180, and then the training and education of people working at sea as well. Then the next part of it is all the ILO countries haven't yet ratified the International Maritime Organization conventions. Some have only been ratified by some member states, and if the EU is going to have its power exemplified, And it is ultimately that allows the EU to have such a high degree of credibility on the world stage. And it's important for those member states that have not yet ratified the convention to do so and to be encouraged to do so. The fourth recommendation is to continue investing in capacity building of third countries in order to help them to implement the provisions of international instruments. That would require a certain amount of training. It would require support that might be brought to bear by means of the various tools at the disposal of the EU, and there are fisheries agreements that would help that. Then the strengthening of cooperation and all the different funds, the relevant funds that the agreements allow to be drawn down on. Finally, then, it's important that the EU be able to leverage its influence as a market state in order to be able to incentivize countries to move towards more sustainable forms of fisheries. The EU is the second biggest importer of fisheries products in the world, and therefore it has a high degree of capability to exert influence and to make sure that there are countries that sell to it that adhere to its requirements, and that they would be then similar or the same as those applied to the fishers in the EU itself.
Thank you very much to both of you for your presentation of the report, and I'll now open the floor for members. Mr. Myanmar first.
Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to our guests for their presentation. It's clearly a very dense report that needs to be carefully studied, beginning with the blue economy. This is essential. There is increased demand for marine space, maritime space. We need it for marine energy and for the rest of the blue economy. Of course, the problem of marine energy can displace fishing activities, and so we need to find solutions to an appropriate sharing out of this area so that the energy and aquaculture and fisheries sectors can coexist side by side. We don't want to sort of ban people from traditions that lasted for centuries. I think the study also clearly describes the challenges that we face, the resistance of certain member states to sign up to certain basic governance standards, which raises a problem for the level playing field, and the importance of the EU and its influence, its potential for leadership, and the changes in that leadership. We've all seen the difficulties that the high seas EU fleet has in certain oceans as regards the FADs in ICAT and also in the Indian Ocean. And I think we need, as a major importer of fisheries products, to wield our influence in the world of fisheries. And I think the trading weight of the EU can be wielded in other areas as well. I mean, we hope we won't have problems with the UK as we have with Norway, but we may have to use other levers. And I think our commercial weight is important, and our external commercial policy, external trade policy and development policy, our relations with third countries, the so-called sustainable fisheries partnership agreements with developing countries. All of these are instruments, I think, that can be placed at the service of fisheries and coordinated to defend the fisheries sector, so that this, our trade power and policy and development policy can work to the benefit of our fishers too.
Señora Wiesner.
Thank you, Ms. Wiesner.
Thank you so much. And I've been thinking a lot about the global competitiveness and the reason why EU is lagging behind and have less productivity, but in the same time we also have higher environmental and social standards. And I was just wondering why then not label of origin is a part of the policy recommendations. That would also give a clear understanding for the consumers that they are buying EU products and also the benefits that comes with that, whereas now it's very unclear for the consumers or in the retail sector to actually know where the product is coming from. It's clearly within EU competence, the internal market and so on. So just wondering, maybe I missed it somewhere here, but I was wondering if that's something that you also assessed, or if it was assessed but it's not here for other reasons. I was wondering why it was not part of the policy recommendations. For us and for Renew, that's one of the clear instruments that we want to see to really raise also the awareness and also increase incentives to buy European. So thank you so much.
Señora Levin.
Ms. Levin.
Madam Chair, I think especially the EU's role globally is extremely important. And of course the CFP standards also apply to EU fishing vessels operating in external waters, which is fabulous. But we also know that there's a lot of European operators that are also fishing under other flags, either in joint ventures, in chartering arrangements, or simply they've been reflagging and they have the beneficial owners are EU nationals. So I think, if the author of the report has any comments on that and how the member states should act in order to make sure that the CFP is really a role model. The second question is on the status, the EU as a market state. 70% of all the seafood that we eat in the European Union is actually imported. So it's extremely important that we make sure that whatever is landing on our plates is sustainably fished. And I'm quite worried that recent studies have shown that a lot of the fish that comes into our stores and for the retailers is not labeled, as my colleague was mentioning. 38% of analyzed processed seafood products in supermarkets lack essential information on their origin. There's also reports about fish coming from China. 124 European companies based in 18 member states were importing seafood products from China, possibly with links to illegal fishing and forced label, and also of Russian origin. And Russian seafood is one of the items that have not been subject to EU sanctions since the invasion of Ukraine. So there's a lot more the EU can do in order to put pressure on other actors, making sure that we have a level playing field, but not to forget about EU citizens still fishing without EU flags outside of the European Union, and what can we do about that? How can we put more pressure on member states to make these operators also live up to CFP standards? Thank you.
Señor Flanagan.
Mr. Flanagan.
Thank you. Another interesting presentation. I have a question for Rod Capel. The blue economy section of the report makes a similar point in relation to small-scale operators needing more direct support than from MFAF alone. And Graham McFadden pointed out that the details of such direct support is outside the scope of this report. So do you have any suggestions on how to explore other avenues for such direct support? And just one point here as well, from the point of view of trying to get people interested in fishing and getting people behind fishers. And as someone who is not a fisher and I'm trying to understand this area, I have to say, what is the obsession with acronyms? Now, maybe you're all used to them, but it's a word I was going to use, but does someone get off on this?
Señora Cámara.
Miss Camara.
Je vais parler en français.
I'll speak French. Very briefly, because it's already been mentioned, but I wanted to talk about international cooperation between the EU and third countries, these bilateral agreements. We've seen that some of these agreements are insufficient in terms of monitoring fleets' behavior and collecting and reporting data on catch. We've heard that there are 39 vessels under Mauritanian or other country flags about which there is insufficient information about any foreign ownership. So even if these vessels are flying a foreign flag, they might be at risk of violating all sorts of rights, including human rights. So what are you doing at international level to fight IUU fishing and also preventing any illegal financial flows coming from illegal fishing activities entering into the EU? Thank you.
Gracias, el señor.
Thank you. Mr. Kappel and Mr. Kayak, you have the floor to answer the various questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll respond to some of those very helpful interventions. On global competitiveness, I would mention that it's not within the Blue Economy section, but Policy Recommendation 3 does talk about developing market standards that ensure a level playing field. So we do address that issue because that is absolutely important to distinguish EU products better in the market and raise awareness of the higher standards to which they're produced. So we do mention that there, absolutely. On how to provide more direct support, I think what we've identified for small-scale operators is that even though there is some funding available, having the match funding to access that just isn't there, irrespective of it being at a 50% level. So some form of collective action, identifying what's needed across small-scale operators, and then working collectively so you can achieve a higher level of support is one thing that could be done, because individually, when they're sort of left alone individually, can be difficult to apply for these funds, and secondly, to actually have that match funding can be quite challenging as well. So hopefully MFAF is now somewhat more flexible to allow for higher support at a collective level. And then I totally agree with you on there's too many TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. We have got 4 pages of them at the start of the report. Apologies for that, but at least you can find them there, hopefully. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try to answer the concerns raised about activities of EU nationals on foreign flagged vessels. As you know, the UN Convention recognises the nationality of a vessel by its flag. The UN Convention doesn't recognise the notion of, the ultimate owner of a vessel, but in EU rules, there's the IUU regulation, which does allow member states to prosecute, where appropriate, nationals who have undertaken illicit fishing activities under other flags. I think some years ago, Spain had a case where they invoked this regulation to put an end to an IUU network of operators. So there is a legal basis. It may not be perfect, but it is usable. If we look at what Spain managed to do a few years ago, so it can be enforced. So it's not as if we had nothing to go on. And then the second point was about imposing sustainability standards for imported products. Well, there are various avenues. that are being explored, it was thought that we could use the regulation on the common organisation of the markets, that in revising this regulation we could have extended the scope of common marketing standards to imported products. I think that instrument needs to be explored further, but there's that possibility. We should bear in mind that the Commission adopted a more global approach in the farm to fork strategy, and in that they are looking into an initiative called the EU food system, which would involve setting sustainability criteria in all trade in food substances in agriculture and fisheries. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Leinemann, would you like to comment on the results of the study on behalf of DG Mare?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you also to the researchers for this this part of the report. You have highlighted the increasing demand for maritime space, and then also the role that member states have in working on maritime spatial planning. I would just like to highlight that over the past 10 years of the existence of the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, the Commission has massively supported the implementation of the directive by member states, not only nationally, but also at sea basin level, so in terms of cooperating. And in her mission letter to Commissioner-designate Cadiz, the President has written that he should strengthen our approach to maritime spatial planning in order to make sure that the different uses of the sea can be reconciled. The Commission has already supported very much the coexistence and the multi-use of space at sea. Earlier this year, in April, we published a so-called compendium of multi-uses where we look at coexistence, for example, also of fisheries, passive or active fisheries in offshore wind areas, but also of aquaculture production or other uses. We have also, the Commission has also published a guidance document on planning and access to space for marine aquaculture, thereby also looking at the multi-use. A few words on international ocean governance and especially the efforts of ratifying international treaties. We have finalized the EU's internal efforts to ratify the Treaty on Biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and we hope to deposit the ratification instrument still this year. And looking at the capacity constraints that are faced by developing countries, together with Spain, the EU is lending support to small islands of the Pacific to assist with their ratification process of this treaty. And we are also supporting the interim secretariat of the treaty to promote ratification in third countries, for example, through workshops with parliamentarians in Africa, in Latin America, and the Caribbean, with 1.4 million euros. At the UN General Assembly this week, we will announce that the Commission has just adopted a global ocean program of 40 million euros in support of marine biodiversity and the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. Finally, we have launched a study on flags of convenience. That is also in reply to one of the questions that came up from Mrs. Lewin. So I would just like to conclude to thank again for this very timely report and its findings, which will be essential to further ensure policy relevance and coherence, and certainly also find its entrance into the EU Ocean Pact that the President announced or mandated to the designated commissioner. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the four presenters and also to members of DG Mare. If you don't mind, we'll now move on to item 7, the penultimate point of our agenda, or the ultimate. As you know, we have a proposal with regard to regulations 2016-1139, 2018-973, and 2019-742, setting fishing opportunities. As I said at the beginning of the meeting, last Monday, there was no broad majority reached between coordinators about how to deal with these files. So we are putting this to you as a full committee. And it's a very simple question. Do you want us to resume our work on this legislative file that was referred to Parliament at the end of last year, according to Rule 250 of the Rules of Procedure? It's a proposal for regulation amending regulations 2016-1139, 2018-973 and 2019-742 as regards setting fishing opportunities. The Conference of Presidents is expecting a response from all committees on unfinished business by the 27th of September. So if you're in favour, we'll vote green, and obviously red if you're against. So the vote is now open. I hope you have your voting card ready, and I declare the vote now open.
Cerramos la votación.
The vote is closed.
Y el resultado es...
And the result is 13 in favour, 13 against. So the proposal falls. And that brings us to item 9, which is the date of the next meeting, as we have exhausted our agenda. So the next meeting will be on the 30th of September, 3 p.m. And from 5:30 to 6:30, there will be a coordinators meeting. Ms. Levine.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Sorry, Madam Chair. Excuse me, but we are a number of members who are a little bit confused. So what does it mean that the proposal falls? What proposal falls?
La propuesta del reglamento.
The proposal on the regulation amending these other regulations, which was the unfinished business from the last Parliament. The vote that has just come out as a draw has the result that we will not resume the work on this proposal, on this regulation. So that is why the proposal will simply lapse and will not go through Parliament any further. So I hope you did understand that before you voted.
Venga, muchas gracias. Gracias y...
Thank you very much, and see you on the 30th. Thank you very much.